The decisive events did not unfold on a battlefield, nor were there any banners unfurled or swords drawn beneath a crimson sky. Instead, the denouement occurred in profound silence, behind locked doors, illuminated only by candlelight. One particular night, within a fortified city steeped in the aroma of incense and rife with intrigue, a clandestine meeting transpired, a gathering conspicuously absent from official historical records. There was no papal bull or royal decree to mark its occurrence, merely whispers that subsequently initiated the disappearance of Christendom's most formidable military order. The Knights Templar were not vanquished by their adversaries, nor were they dismantled through legal means. Rather, they were ostensibly betrayed, perhaps by their most trusted allies. This enduring mystery compels inquiry. What precisely occurred in that room, and who emerged with hands unsullied by overt conflict? The echoes of hooves have long since faded, and the clamor of crowds is now a distant memory. All that persists is the cold stone of history, punctuated by the faint creak of a metaphorical door that now stands ajar. It is prudent to set aside the more sensationalized accounts, and, instead, delve into a quieter corridor of the past, one veiled in the soft glow of suspicion and candlelight. Imagine a formidable gate, massive and studded with iron, framed by walls that have absorbed more secrets than sunlight. The air around it is palpably damp, imbued with the faint scent of aged parchment, beeswax, and the hushed cadence of Latin prayers. Beyond this portal lies Avignon, the temporary epicenter of the Christian world. The year is 1306. The fervor of the Crusades has diminished, and the Templars, once revered as holy warriors, have transitioned into roles more akin to financiers than knights. They commanded vast landholdings, immense wealth, and numerous secrets. Soon, they would possess nothing. No official invitation was extended to any party for the meeting in question. Indeed, there exists no parchment, no witness, nor any signature confirming its existence. Yet, history's most pivotal junctures often materialize not on official documents but in the shadows, behind doors such as this one. It is widely asserted that sometime in late 1306, within Avignon's heavily guarded precincts, a discreet conversation culminated in a quiet agreement. Some chroniclers suggest it involved Pope Clement V and King Philip IV of France. Others theorize that secret envoys, possibly even disloyal Templars, gained entry through the gates under the shroud of darkness. The precise words exchanged remain unknown. Only the subsequent events are documented. Less than a year later, the Templars were systematically dismantled, their power eradicated, members arrested and tortured, assets seized, leaders immolated, and their names subjected to centuries of infamy. While some interpreted these actions as justice, others perceived profound betrayal. Those who observed closely, cognizant of the Templars' true significance, suspected something far more calculated: a decision, a clandestine arrangement, a final and private reckoning. This inquiry seeks to unravel that enigma, focusing not on battles or legends, hidden treasures or secret tunnels, but on the subtle reverberations of history's most profound and quiet betrayal. Our exploration commences with the final utterances of a dying Grand Master, tracing clues backward, step by step, until we once again approach that clandestine meeting room, confronting a question that lingers like smoke within the Vatican vaults. As we advance deeper into these historical shadows, consider the importance of sustained inquiry, ensuring that insights into history's forgotten secrets are not overlooked. Now, metaphorically, the gate creaks open, and candlelight flickers down the hall. One will not find a literal signpost indicating the truth, but with meticulous attention, one might discern the faint echo of voices, long silenced, a resonant sound that emerges only after a door has been definitively, quietly shut. Standing in a frigid courtyard beneath a sky the color of aged pewter, the air moves slowly, heavy with the scent of damp stone and scorched wood. Before us, a figure remains unyielding. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, had already attained legendary status by the time his lips parted for the final time. It was the 18th of March, 1314. Having endured imprisonment, interrogation, and public humiliation, he now stood on a small platform, erected on the Ile de la Cité in Paris, his wrists bound, with flames already consuming the air beneath him. Yet, his pronouncements, his audacious challenge, would reverberate far beyond that square, long after the fire had claimed his physical form. He publicly summoned both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV, demanding that they meet him before God's throne in the near future. Some accounts suggest he cursed them, others maintain he merely sought divine justice. Regardless, both the Pope and the King died within the year. However, beneath the dramatic facade of that ultimate scene lies a more subdued element, one frequently overlooked by chroniclers. Molay did not address the charges leveled against him. He offered no defense of the Order's wealth, its power, or its legacy. He provided no public explanation, only this haunting final challenge. What crucial information did he withhold? Why did he remain silent regarding the internal mechanisms of the Order's downfall? He had years between his arrest and execution, ample time to speak, to write, to accuse. Yet, no letter penned by him survives, no coherent defense, only fragmented testimonies extracted under torture, and a final speech that generates more questions than answers. Herein lies the genesis of profound curiosity. While historians frequently concentrate on Molay's suffering, a select few, typically the more discreet scholars within the archives, focus on his knowledge. He was an eyewitness to the entirety of the Order's collapse, having observed the shifting tides, first slowly, then with sudden rapidity. Furthermore, he was present in France, in close proximity to both papal and royal circles, merely months prior to the Order's abrupt demise. His silence was not merely stoic, it may have been meticulously calculated. A theory, often whispered among Templar historians who prioritize obscure details over widespread recognition, suggests that Molay possessed knowledge of a specific meeting. This was not merely a betrayal, but a negotiation, implying that he had stood at the precipice of a momentous deal, or worse, participated at the table, compelled to make an impossible choice. Maintaining an unwavering stance might have led to the complete annihilation of the Order. A quiet capitulation, however, offered a slender hope for some members' survival. Yet, if such an agreement existed, it was demonstrably breached. Perhaps King Philip overstepped his bounds, perhaps Pope Clement lost control, or perhaps another entity, an individual whose name never entered official ledgers, determined that the Templars held greater value as ashes than as allies. Jacques de Molay's silence, therefore, begins to appear less as an absence and more as a deliberate seal, a conscious decision to conceal crucial information. What might he have gained by fully disclosing the truth? More significantly, what might have been irrevocably lost? A curious footnote, buried within a late 14th century French chronicle, asserts that in his final hours, Molay requested the presence of a Dominican friar. This request was unusual not only because this friar was unconnected to the local abbey, but also because his identity remains unrecorded, his arrival and departure passed unnoted. The friar reportedly received Molay's private confession and departed Paris before dawn. Some speculate that this friar was not a friar at all, but a courier, entrusted by Molay with something of profound significance, perhaps a warning, or a truth intended to endure beyond the pyre. Naturally, this particular lead quickly fades into obscurity. This brings us to a broader, persistent question that vexes anyone endeavoring to reconstruct this quiet unraveling. The Templars did not collapse due to military defeat, nor did they implode from scandal or financial ruin. They represented one of Europe's most powerful, structured, and wealthy organizations, deeply integrated into courts, monarchies, and crusading efforts. Their demise occurred almost overnight. In such circumstances of sudden, enforced silence, calculated inaction can be a potent strategy. What if Molay's silence was not born of an inability to speak, but a deliberate refusal? And if so, was it motivated by loyalty or by fear? Did he hope to preserve the last vestiges of the order's honor? Or was he protecting an individual, perhaps even an agreement that had already been concluded? One might reasonably inquire whether such internal workings were documented. Surely a note, a scroll, or some private correspondence among commanders must have existed. Yet, the peculiar reality is that such records are not merely missing, they appear to have been systematically expunged. Entire sections of Templar archive listings disappear around 1307. They were not destroyed by fire or seized. Rather, their absence is polite, almost tidy. Such a vanishing act suggests not destruction or theft, but permission. In this context, Molay's silence appears less as an admission of defeat and more as an act of obedience, a quiet, unyielding compliance. This compliance was likely not born of loyalty to his brethren, but of obligation to something far more delicate, something negotiated in a room whose full reality we may never ascertain. Naturally, all of this remains speculative. Establishing certainties is inherently difficult when the flames of history have long since abated and the paper trail concludes in ash. Yet, persistent patterns emerge, conspicuous absences, well-timed deaths, and meticulous disappearances. Therefore, our inquiry commences with this silence, a weighty stillness, akin to the pause preceding a secret either spoken or forever interred. The last Grand Master may have perished publicly, but his knowledge remains a private enigma. The only question is, for how much longer will it remain so? As one navigates the cold stone corridors of the Papal Palace in Avignon, candles flicker against the damp walls, their light softened by centuries of accumulated smoke and the scent of ancient manuscripts. Voices, faint and buried beneath layers of prayer and protocol, seem to resonate here. Yet, for this investigation, one must listen for something even more subtle, the sound of a door that was never intended to open. Sometime during the final months of 1306, an unusual series of arrivals began in Avignon. A minor official from the French court was discreetly observed disembarking from a barge on the Rhône. A Templar representative, notably no longer displaying the order's red cross, arrived on horseback from Poitiers. A notary from Provence, typically stationed in Paris, appeared in the city and took residence at a cloister situated outside the walls. While no direct accounts document these movements, a meticulous examination of the margins of travel logs, letters, and expense reports reveals the contours of a coordinated, quiet, and unexplained migration. There was no formal invitation, nor does any surviving document confirm a planned meeting. Yet, a peculiar alignment of absences becomes apparent. Key figures, some with ties to both the Vatican and the French crown, were absent from their customary duties during the same confined period of days. Pope Clement V's schedule for late autumn 1306, typically exhaustive, becomes notably sparse. King Philip IV is reported to be indisposed, but offers no official explanation. Even Templar records, usually rigorous and comprehensive, contain curious omissions. A particular knight failed to submit his monthly reports for November. When questioned later, he offered no excuse, merely an enigmatic and weary phrase. The wind blew from the Rhône that week. Consequently, a theory arises that during those unrecorded days, in a private wing of the Avignon complex, or perhaps within a smaller, nearby structure, a meeting transpired. Its purpose was to determine the fate of the Knights Templar, not through official edict or public trial, but through discreet negotiation. This theory might appear romantic, even conspiratorial, were it not for one chilling detail. Merely weeks after this period of silence, the frequency of international communication escalated. Papal agents began requesting financial inventories from religious orders throughout France, including the Templars. Royal couriers traversed more frequently between Paris and Avignon. New legal terminology started to emerge in clerical correspondence, featuring phrases such as restructuring, transitional enforcement, and contingent authority. Individually, these are merely bureaucratic anomalies. Collectively, they form a foreboding rhythm, signifying an impending event. Among scholars who study this peculiar prelude, debate persists, but not regarding the occurrence of the meeting itself. Rather, the central question revolves around who attended and what concessions were made. Some suspect that Jacques de Molay, perhaps under duress, dispatched a deputy. Others believe he attended himself, succumbing to pressure. There is even a fringe theory suggesting a splinter group within the Templars undertook the journey independently, offering covert cooperation in exchange for their own survival. Here, the details become exceptionally nebulous. For if an invitation existed, someone would have preserved it, not on vellum for public display, but perhaps in a private ledger or diary. Yet, nothing remains. It is as if not merely the document, but its very memory has been expunged. Some contend the evidence was deliberately destroyed. Others believe it still exists, concealed within a private collection, perhaps even deep within the Vatican archives, where numerous rooms remain uncatalogued. However, a particularly anomalous footnote exists in the Avignon records. For 1306, a room labeled simply Custodia Temporalis is logged as occupied under discretion for 5 nights that winter. The entry bears no names, no titles, only the Latin phrase indicating it was closed to routine. If one permits the implications to unfold, it becomes possible to envision that the Knights Templar were not ambushed but forewarned, that the meeting was not a trap but a transaction, and that somewhere, someone perhaps cloaked, perhaps veiled, perhaps hooded by more than mere fabric presented a choice. Yet, that choice could not have been a simple capitulation. Had it been so, an orderly dissolution would have ensued, marked by resignation rather than resistance. Instead, what materialized was a storm: arrests, trials, immolations, and a pervasive silence. This indicates that something within that meeting fractured, or someone was deceptive. There is a peculiar consistency in betrayals of this magnitude. They rarely commence with raised voices or slamming doors. They begin with polite nods and sealed letters, with measured tones and promises disguised as prayers. The invitation, if it ever existed, might have been nothing more than a whispered phrase in a church cloister, a subtle hand placed upon a shoulder, a summons delivered without explicit words. Thus, we are left pursuing shadows, a week that vanished, individuals seen and then unobserved, and a phrase from an anonymous memoir of the period. They met, but not as friends. Regardless of whether the invitation was ever formally written, the message was undoubtedly received, and the response, whatever its nature, initiated the ensuing tragedy. One can almost perceive it now: the scratch of a quill, the soft thud of a seal pressed into warm wax, a rider saddling a horse in the dead of night, bearing a message intended not for history, but for consequence. A message leaving no mark, except in the profound shifts that followed. One now confronts a calendar, not merely any calendar, but the meticulously recorded papal itinerary of Clement V. Scribes, trained to preserve every movement of the pontiff with obsessive detail, every audience, every mass, every sent and received letter maintained this record. The Holy Father, it seems, could not even sneeze without someone noting the precise timing. Yet, within this exhaustive account, there exists a conspicuous lacuna. In late November of 1306, amidst the usual flurry of entries pertaining to liturgical duties, diplomatic visitors, and notarial records, one entire day is simply absent, a blank space where ink should be. Not a correction or an erasure, but an uncharacteristic silence within an otherwise fastidious record. This might not arouse suspicion in a different context. Even pontiffs are granted quiet days. However, Clement V was not a quiescent pope, particularly in 1306. The Templars were growing increasingly restive, and the French crown was discreetly pressuring him to act. The timing of this missing day could not be more inconvenient for those seeking to dismiss it. It falls precisely within the window when, According to secondary sources, a secret delegation may have arrived in Avignon. To be fair, historical records are invariably incomplete. Archivists fall ill, parchments are misplaced, and ink fades. Yet, this specific day is situated between entries of impeccable precision. Before and after, every hour is accounted for, which renders its absence particularly stark. It resembles a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. Some researchers have speculated that the gap was not a clerical oversight, but a deliberate choice that Clement intentionally ordered the omission of that day's activities, requesting no notes be taken, no scribes present, no witnesses, only the echo of his own footsteps and the words of his interlocutor. Here, the situation becomes further convoluted. While the papal diary grows silent, another source, a journal kept by a Dominican brother named Edward of Apt, mentions observing unfamiliar guards stationed near a lesser-used wing of the palace during the same time frame. Brother Edward, not prone to gossip, merely recorded. The side corridor was shuttered today. Extra men-at-arms posted by the Carmelite stairs. The bells rang thrice, though no mass was held. He provides no further explanation. Is it plausible that this was the location of the secret meeting, a secluded corner of the palace, accessible via side passages, reserved exclusively for those the Pope wished to receive in private? Some scholars believe so. Others caution against over-interpreting the evidence. However, the lack of official explanation invites speculation. Why would Clement, a man of fragile health and delicate political standing, choose this specific moment to vanish from his own schedule? It is also pertinent to note that Clement V had recently relocated the papacy from Rome to Avignon, an unprecedented move that granted him greater autonomy but also placed him in closer proximity to the French king. At the time, many considered him a reluctant puppet of Philip IV. His decisions frequently reflected external pressure more than personal principle, which underscores the significance of this missing day. If a meeting occurred, if even a single Templar delegate or French official sat across from Clement during that unrecorded window, then everything that transpired thereafter might trace back to it. The silence may not merely be bureaucratic. It could be the inaugural sign of complicity. A fragile irony permeates this situation. The papacy is ostensibly the custodian of divine truth. Its records are considered sacred, its routines integral to the rhythm of Christendom. Yet, within the very heart of this grand and holy machinery, there lies a quiet deletion, a single day excised like a loose thread, devoid of explanation or footnote. A few scholars argue that the day's omission was health-related, as Clement was often unwell and suffered frequent bouts of illness. Perhaps he was merely resting. However, this theory falters under closer scrutiny. The days preceding and following are replete with entries requiring physical activity, mass, meetings, processions. There is no indication of convalescence. Even when Clement was indisposed, his location and condition were typically recorded. His absence was never intended to be private. Thus, we are left with this: a pope who vanished for a day, a palace that briefly fell silent, and a series of coincidental movements across France that suggest something far more substantial was unfolding just beyond public view. This resonates with Molay's silence, does it not? The same deliberate absence, the same refusal to leave a discernible trail. What is it about these individuals, bound by power and secrecy, that draws them to silence rather than explicit declaration? More importantly, what did they fear would transpire if someone did speak? The missing day remains a significant source of frustration for scholars who seek patterns. It offers little concrete information, merely the ghost of an event, a tear in the historical fabric. Yet, sometimes that is all that is required. For when a record previously impeccable suddenly falters, it usually signifies that something was uttered that should not have been heard. If the Pope met someone that day, their identity may forever remain unknown, but someone did. Someone who chose perhaps to bring no letter, affix no seal, leave no footprint, only a voice in a guarded room, and a silence that has persisted for more than 7 centuries. One can still vividly imagine the scene: a single candle, a wooden chair gently scraping across the floor, a man in white robes seated opposite a visitor he could not acknowledge. Outside, the scribes awaited instruction. Inside, a future was being irrevocably rewritten. There is a particular haunting quality to an individual who purposefully vanishes. The silence surrounding such a person is unlike death. It is more deliberate, more carefully curated, akin to a museum exhibit missing a single object, its absence framed in velvet and glass. This is the pervasive sensation one encounters when examining the account of Brother Amory. His name surfaces only a handful of times in the surviving records, yet each appearance is like a metallic gleam in a darkened cavern, too precise to be mere coincidence. He was a high-ranking Templar official, possibly a provincial commander from western France, although documents dispute whether he reported directly to Jacques de Molay or another regional master. What is unequivocally clear, however, is that Brother Amory was last observed in Avignon in late autumn 1306, precisely during the narrow window previously identified the period marked by missing diaries, shuttered corridors, and unacknowledged visits. Following this, there is nothing. No arrest record, no trial, no mention in the Chinon proceedings, no burial, no expulsion, no excommunication. It is as though he stepped through a doorway in Avignon and simply never re-emerged. At first glance, this might appear to be a simple clerical oversight, as numerous records from this era are lost, damaged, or fragmentary. However, Amory's disappearance possesses too many sharp edges to be dismissed as accidental. He was not a minor figure. He appears on a shipping manifest in Bordeaux weeks prior to the suspected meeting, commanding a consignment of Templar goods en route to Avignon, possibly gifts, possibly collateral. The manifest details coins, precious cloth, sealed documents, and an unusually annotated item labeled merely lignum crucis, or wood of the cross. The implication, of course, is that this might have been a relic, or a counterfeit relic. Either way, it held considerable value. This convoy arrived, and Amory disembarked. A stable ledger indicates his horse was boarded in Avignon for 6 nights. On the 7th day, however, it was claimed by another rider unidentified, hooded, and bearing a writ signed not by the Templars, but by a local church official. That specific writ no longer exists. Only the stableman's receipt of it remains, and after that, silence. Scholars dedicated to the Templar downfall are familiar with Amory's name precisely because of these gaps, rather than concrete facts. His disappearance features in footnotes, theoretical discussions, and the frustrated marginalia of archivists. Some hypothesize he was the Templar delegate who attended the secret meeting, perhaps sent ahead in a bid to secure a compromise. Others contend he acted unilaterally, offering information in exchange for protection, or worse, that he defected, aligning himself with either Clement or Philip in the final days preceding the collapse. A peculiar reference appears in a letter from a Dominican inquisitor, written months later, describing an unnamed knight seen living under another name in Marseille. The inquisitor dismisses the sighting as unreliable, but notes that the man wore a ring bearing no sigil and was guarded in his silence. The detail of the ring is odd. Templars were prohibited from wearing personal insignia. A ring devoid of a seal or crest could imply many things, but in this context, it might have signified allegiance to no one. Here, we encounter something even more enigmatic. What if Brother Amory was neither a traitor nor a diplomat? What if he represented an entirely different type of agent, one the Order held in reserve for critical moments such as this? An internal envoy, entrusted with messages too sensitive to commit to writing, too volatile to repeat aloud? The sort of figure dispatched when no official record of the exchange is desired, only confirmation that it occurred. If this sounds improbable, consider the Templars' operational methods. They were a military order, certainly, but also a logistical powerhouse. They moved money, secrets, and personnel with ruthless efficiency, employing coded signs, double-entry ledgers, and compartmentalized routes. It would have been entirely within their capabilities to send a representative without paper, without a name, and without a traceable path. So, why did Amory vanish? Was he silenced because of what he knew, or because of what he failed to deliver? Was he hidden, protected, perhaps as part of a broader compromise that necessitated the sacrifice of others? Or did he simply depart, choosing self-preservation over institutional loyalty? His trail resurfaces one last time in the most unexpected of places. An anonymous entry in the Liber Obscurum, a 14th century text compiled by monastic scribes, fascinated by disappearances and miracles. One page lists a knight without colors, once of the temple, who lives now in shadow, bearing witness only to silence. This is likely poetic interpretation, but the phrasing has resonated with historians for centuries. And that particular phrase, bearing witness only to silence, seems to resonate with Molay's final moments and the Pope's missing day, a recurring pattern of withheld truths, of individuals who might have spoken but either did not or could not. One might reflect on what Amory would reveal if he possessed the ability to speak. If he was still alive, concealed under an assumed identity, observing the slow grind of justice and memory, would he regret his choice? Or was silence, for him, a form of obedience? Or perhaps even a form of power? It is impossible to definitively state, and that is the element that persistently echoes through the corridors of this narrative, not the grand gestures, the roaring bonfires, or the shattered reputations, but the gaps, the elegant, deliberate lacunae. If Brother Amory was indeed the messenger dispatched to Avignon, he may have delivered something that can never be recovered. Not a letter, not a threat, but a signal. A nod, the kind of gesture that terminates an order. Not with a war, but with a whisper. Our focus now shifts to Paris. Not the luminous city of boulevards and balconies, but an older, heavier Paris. A labyrinth of cold stone, damp air, and politics sharp enough to wound without leaving a visible mark. This is the Paris of King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, though his exercise of power exhibited precious little fairness. His legendary beauty belied a calculating gaze and a thin smile. He was a man who tallied coins with the devotion of prayers and treated his adversaries as debts, to be collected or expunged. For many years, the Knights Templar were neither. They were allies, friends of the throne, custodians of royal treasure. Philip had relied upon them in times of both war and peace. He even sought membership himself, with some sources claiming an honorary induction into their elite spiritual ranks. The Templars had financed his military campaigns, safeguarded his riches, and hosted him within their Paris commandery, a fortress so impregnable it was simply known as the Temple. Such was their relationship until, almost instantaneously, it ceased to be. In the months following the rumored clandestine meeting in Avignon, Philip's entire demeanor toward the Templars underwent a profound transformation, initially subtly, then with terrifying clarity. He commenced intelligence gathering, posing pointed questions through intermediaries. Then, abruptly, on Friday, the 13th of October 1307, he struck. Dawn raids swept across France. Templars were simultaneously apprehended in an operation so perfectly coordinated that it must have been weeks, perhaps months in the making. The order faced accusations of heresy, blasphemy, and secret rites involving the desecration of the cross and the worship of pagan idols. Accusations so theatrical they might have adorned an illuminated manuscript replete with demons and fiery eyes. Yet, for Philip, they served a utilitarian purpose. He required public justification, a conflagration loud enough to obscure the sound of coin purses being sealed shut, for beneath the veneer of piety lay a more immediate concern: debt. Philip owed the Templars enormous sums. France's protracted wars, royal extravagance, and ill-conceived tax experiments had depleted the crown's reserves. The Templars were wealthy discreetly, quietly, globally wealthy, and that made them an irresistible target. Thus, the critical question arises: why, at this precise moment? Philip had been aware of the Templars' wealth, secrecy, autonomy, and their somewhat unconventional spiritual practices for years. None of this was novel. If they posed a danger, they had been dangerous for decades. Why postpone action until late 1306 or early 1307? Here, the timeline constricts like a noose. Shortly after the missing day in the Pope's diary and the mysterious disappearance of Brother Amory, Philip's private council began to convene with increased frequency. His letters to the Vatican grew more pointed, more urgent. His legal advisors commenced drafting the charges that would later form the bedrock of the Templar trials. One theory postulates that the secret meeting included a veiled offer from Clement, permission, or at least non-interference, in Philip's strategy. Perhaps Clement, apprehensive about losing control of the order, or fearful of what the Templars might yet reveal, agreed to feign ignorance in exchange for specific papal privileges or political security. Philip, emboldened, initiated the preparation of the accusatory machinery. Intriguingly, a draft letter exists, penned by Philip's notary around this period, addressed to certain faithful bishops, warning of a rot within the sacred orders that must be excised without delay. It was never dispatched, but its very existence suggests Philip's offensive was being prepared prior to the arrests. He did not uncover heresy, he engineered a case. The initial backlash was muted. The public was shocked, certainly, but they listened, primarily because the narrative was vociferous, and the Templars remained silent, too silent. Jacques de Molay denied the charges, but not with forceful assertion. The order, long bound by vows of discipline and secrecy, struggled to mount a public defense, and as they hesitated, the king filled the silence with accusations, and later, flames. This point leads some historians to question whether Philip's shift in policy was truly his own initiative. Was he merely the executor of a decision formulated elsewhere? Was the meeting in Avignon not a consultation, but a directive, subtly conveyed by the Pope and rigorously enforced by the Crown? It is worth recalling that Philip had engaged in similar actions previously. Years earlier, he expelled the Jews from France, confiscating their property. He engaged in conflict with the papacy over taxation rights. He even orchestrated the arrest of Pope Boniface VIII's agents. The man was not unacquainted with fabricating moral indignation for material gain. Therefore, when he turned against the Templars, it was not an act of sudden revelation. It was strategy, a cold, glittering maneuver on the European chessboard. The fact that Clement did not publicly condemn the arrests, at least initially, speaks volumes. In politics, silence frequently signifies consent. This abrupt reversal by Philip also connects back to the peculiar timing of earlier events. The week the Templar representative disappeared, the day the Pope vanished from his schedule, the surge in encrypted correspondence between the Vatican and the French court. If these were mere coincidences, they represent the most exquisitely choreographed coincidences in the annals of medieval European history. However, perhaps the most peculiar element of all is that, despite his aggression, Philip appeared anxious. In personal correspondence, he implored the Pope to support the arrests, to validate the charges. He even journeyed to Poitiers in 1308, seeking a joint tribunal. This does not sound like a man fully in control. It sounds like someone operating under pressure or fear. Fear that the Templars might retaliate, that something concealed within that quiet meeting room might surface. Of course, it never did. The order fell. The coffers changed hands. The king, for a time, was content. But the sharpness of Philip's pivot, from protector to persecutor, remains one of the most revealing clues in this entire affair. Power typically does not lurch. It creeps, unless someone is manipulating the levers. Thus, perhaps the true question is not why Philip turned against the Templars, but rather, who granted him permission. Imagine sitting in a warm archive room in southern France. The sun, filtering through high stained glass windows, casts soft light across rows of ancient parchment. Some documents are curled with age, others lie flat, pressed beneath thin panes of glass. One particular letter commands attention, not for its explicit content, but for what it meticulously attempts to conceal. It is a papal letter, dated December 1306, conspicuously undelivered. Addressed in elegant Latin script to Cardinal Berenger Fredol the Elder, one of Pope Clement V's most trusted advisors, the handwriting is precise, deliberate, almost reverent. However, it is the seal that proves most compelling. It has been broken and subsequently repressed, not once, but twice. The wax exhibits cracks, and the impression of the papal ring bears subtle indications of having been applied on multiple occasions. This detail might not raise alarm if it were a personal letter or a routine directive. Yet, the letter carries a marginal notation to be carried only by hand, not to pass through clerical channels. This was an instruction intended to circumvent the entirety of the church bureaucracy, deliberately and discreetly. The contents within are maddeningly vague. A few lines concerning the matter under discretion, a mention of unified judgment between the sacred office and the crown, and one cryptic phrase, "The men in white must yield before spring, or the tide will shift beyond control." The phrase reads like poetry, yet it pulsates with tension and echoes language found nowhere else in the Vatican's diplomatic correspondence, suggesting either a code or an unspoken agreement, comprehensible only to a select few. The letter was never delivered. Cardinal Fredol was in Rome at the time, and the letter was discovered years later in a forgotten cabinet within the Avignon archives. Its very survival is anomalous. Most undelivered papal letters were destroyed to safeguard secrecy. This particular document, however, was gently placed in a velvet pouch and stored among receipts for timber and wine, almost as if someone wished it to disappear without outright destruction. The broken seal prompts difficult questions. Who opened it? More importantly, why was it resealed? One theory posits that it was intercepted by someone within the Vatican, not an adversary, but an insider, a hand trusted enough to open private communication and dangerous enough to suppress it. It might even have been Fredol himself, upon its belated arrival, choosing to read and enter it rather than act upon it. Alternatively, it could have been opened in transit by an agent of the Crown, ensuring the message aligned with royal interests before it reached its intended recipient. It is not solely the seal that implies interference. The parchment displays faint impressions consistent with having been folded, unfolded, and folded again, a practice indicative of nervous handling. The wax residue reveals a second, fainter stamp beneath the top seal, possibly from a bishop or another cardinal. Experts diverge on this interpretation, but the true enigma lies in how this letter integrates into the escalating turmoil of that winter. By December 1306, the alleged secret meeting had likely already transpired. The Templar envoy, perhaps Brother Amory, had already vanished, and Philip IV's inner circle was commencing the intricate planning of the vast machinery that would crush the order. What then was the role of this letter? Some believe it served as a follow-up, a confirmation of the Vatican's participation in the covert plan. Others view it as a warning. Perhaps Clement experienced second thoughts, fearing that Philip would act too aggressively, too prematurely, that the terms discussed in the shadows would be abandoned the moment they became inconvenient. However, if this letter was a warning, it arrived too late. The wheels were already in motion. Arrest lists were being compiled, financial inventories requested, interrogators trained, and somewhere, someone had already decreed that the Order of the Temple would not survive the ensuing year. The language itself warrants scrutiny. The men in white must yield. The Templars, of course, were renowned for their white mantles adorned with red crosses. The phrasing suggests surrender, but surrender of what? Their property, their autonomy, or perhaps their very identity? And what of the tide that would shift? This could refer to political alliances, or perhaps more abstractly, to spiritual influence. The Templars were more than mere soldiers. They were powerful symbols, possessing considerable spiritual weight. If they refused to yield, the Pope might have feared that this untethered and wounded power would gravitate towards schism or heresy. If this interpretation holds, then this letter represents a subtle piece of theological diplomacy, a final plea for peace before overt aggression erupted. And the broken seal? Perhaps it was not a betrayal, but an act of preservation, a means to delay the inevitable. This brings us once again to that unsettling chorus reverberating throughout this narrative: silence, delay, disappearance. The seal mirrors Mole's refusal to speak plainly, the missing day in the diary, the unnamed friar who heard a final confession and departed before dawn. Even the seal itself, an object intended to affirm truth, here becomes an instrument of manipulation, cracked, repressed, as if the truth, too, required alteration before its disclosure. Some historians propose that the letter functioned as a decoy, dispatched to ascertain who might intercept it, containing no substantive information but serving to expose a hidden player, perhaps an informant within the Curia or a spy in the king's service. If so, whether the trap succeeded remains unknown. No mention of consequences, no trial, no scapegoat. However, a pattern is unmistakably forming a rhythm of vanishing documents, individuals who fail to arrive, phrases obscured within poetry and code, and now a seal twice fractured, like a heartbeat skipped and then forced to resume. One might imagine the cardinal holding the letter late at night, the candle flickering low, reading those strange, suggestive words, folding it again, pressing the wax into place with hands that trembled slightly, then concealing it where it would remain undiscovered for an extended period. And yet, here it is, a voice faint but intact, whispering from the parchment. They knew, they chose, and now they wait. One now stands on the banks of the Vienne River, just outside the austere grey limestone fortress of Chinon. The air is redolent with the scent of damp earth and moss-covered stone. The fortress looms, its towers worn yet resolute, casting long shadows across the winter landscape. And somewhere within its winding halls and sealed cells, a document was signed, one that continues to perplex historians to this day. In the final days of 1306, or the earliest weeks of 1307, depending on which version of the timeline is favored, a sealed order was dispatched from Chinon. Notably, it originated not from the king, nor from the papal court in Avignon, but from within the prison walls of this remote fortress. Its contents remain unknown, its recipient uncertain. However, its existence is real, referenced obliquely in a clerical inventory as a directive de concilio speciale, or a directive of special council. What renders this curious is not merely its origin from Chinon, but its timing. At that juncture, no official tribunal was underway. No public charges against the Templars had yet been made. Chinon was not yet a prison for the order's leadership. It served merely as a discreet royal outpost for classified deliberations and private affairs. Yet, this document, marked with a non-standard seal and conspicuously absent from the royal register, was dispatched with considerable urgency. Some believe it was a precursor to the Chinon parchment, the more widely known document that absolved the Templar leaders of heresy in a secret papal trial held months later. However, this earlier order predated those events prior to the arrests, prior to the public being instructed to fear the Knights in White. This raises the critical question: what precisely was being ordered? Theories span a wide spectrum. One suggests it was a recall order, a message to Templar preceptories to gather records and destroy anything too sensitive for scrutiny. Another proposes it was a conditional guarantee of safety, part of a covert agreement brokered between the Vatican, the Crown, and a select few within the order. A third, more enigmatic theory posits that it was not a command at all, but a signal, a warning, a quiet flicker of candlelight disseminated across the network of Templar houses. It is beginning. The order is referenced only once in the Chinon fortress logbooks. Its dispatch is noted, but the copy is missing. The space in the record where the contents summary would typically appear is left blank. Instead, there is a small symbol, an inked circle bisected, resembling a solar eclipse. This symbol appears nowhere else in the Chinon records, neither before nor after. Here, the narrative becomes more intricate. The Chinon parchment, discovered in 2001 within the Vatican secret archives, was long considered the definitive statement on Templar absolution, proof that the Pope, behind closed doors, forgave the order. However, with this earlier order now in view, some scholars argue that the entire affair was orchestrated from its inception, that Clement's absolution was always part of a larger theatrical production, and that the secret order from Chinon laid the groundwork not for justice, but for control. There is also the matter of who was present at Chinon during those weeks. Royal officials, at least one inquisitor, possibly a papal envoy traveling under an assumed identity, and, if certain obscure monastic correspondences are to be credited, a figure known only as l'Anonyme de la Roche, or the Anonymous of the Rock, a man with no official title but considerable influence. He reappears in later documents, always unnamed, always in proximity to events where decisions were made discreetly. His handwriting, in fact, matches the marginalia in the Vatican's unsigned Oath of Avignon, a document to be explored subsequently. The web titans, whoever dispatched the Chinon order, evidently wished it not to be attributed to any known authority. The use of an unofficial seal suggests a desire to maintain plausible deniability. The absence of a content summary implies that whatever was written was intended for eyes that already understood its implications. One can readily visualize the scene. A small chamber deep within the fortress bowels, a figure writing by lamplight, a messenger awaiting with gloved hands, prepared to ride through the night. No ceremony, no choir, merely wax, parchment, and purpose. A second layer of this enigma emerged several weeks after the Chinon dispatch, when reports began to surface of peculiar activities on Templar properties. Fires ignited in the middle of the night, documents retrieved and buried, crypts opened and then resealed. In one abbey near Toulouse, a monk claimed to have witnessed Templars removing names from their own gravestones, chiseling away inscriptions with grim urgency. These events coincide too closely with the Chinon timeline to be dismissed. It is as if someone whispered into the darkness, and the entire order recoiled. If the order was indeed a warning, it arrived too late for many. The mass arrests of October 1307 swept across France with brutal efficiency, yet some Templars vanished before the dawn raids. Some properties had already been emptied, and some treasures were never recovered. A head start, it seems, was granted to a select few, or perhaps, more chillingly, it was purchased. The notion that the destruction of the Templars was not a spontaneous event, but a negotiated collapse, gains considerable traction here. The Chinon order represents a loose thread within a tapestry woven by hidden hands. Not a smoking gun, perhaps, but a breath, warm and recent on the neck of history. One is left with a page that no longer exists, a symbol that should mean nothing, and an indelible sense that someone, somewhere, issued a command with consequences that continue to reverberate. For the fortress still stands, its stone walls retain memory, and deep within its ancient bones, the air still whispers of a message sent and of what it set into motion. What significance should be attached to these fragments? Are they merely the hallucinations of terrified individuals, the blurred half-memories of dreams induced by pain and sleep deprivation? Or were they genuine flashes of truth, partly obscured by fear? The Tower of Rouen was not a public prison. It was reserved for those awaiting something more severe than mere justice. Its walls had confined both heretics and nobles, all reduced to silence beneath its vaulted ceilings. And within those stone walls, one account continues to send a chill through modern historians. Brother Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy and a close confidant of Grand Master Molay, was among the highest-ranking Templars imprisoned at Rouen. In a marginal note discovered in the Inquisition scrolls, a scribe records that Charny, upon his initial arrival at the tower, requested a moment of private prayer, during which he reportedly stated, "Not to God, but to a wall. You warned us too softly." The scribe offers no further elaboration. He might not have comprehended the remark, or perhaps he feared to inquire. However, that single line discreetly placed alongside formal testimony, has become one of the most debated phrases in all of Templar historiography. Who issued the warning, when, and most damningly, why was it not more insistent? We return once more to the concept of a signal, some covert communication, either dispatched too late or entirely disregarded. This connects to the shadowy order from Chinon and the rumors of sealed letters that were never delivered. But here in Rouen, the consequence becomes profoundly human. One can almost perceive it in Charney's countenance, described in one record as pale, unmoving, except the eyes, which seemed not to perceive the present. This is not the gaze of a confused man. It is the gaze of someone who has suffered betrayal. Further supporting the idea of a last-minute warning is the presence of a Benedictine monk named Henri of Mont Saint-Michel, who served in the infirmary attached to the tower. He maintained a brief diary, not intended for posterity, merely containing jottings about weather and rations. However, one entry stands out. Dated 2 nights before the arrests, it reads, "Unusual activity in the lower cells. Lanterns late. A messenger arrived, refused bread, spoke to none, vanished by sunrise." No official record of such a visitor exists. Who was this individual? A Vatican courier? A Templar defector? Or perhaps one of the shadowy figures we have begun to discern, those who belong neither to the king nor the pope, but move between their respective spheres of influence. Henri never mentions the messenger again, nor does he record any reply from the prisoners. However, one presumes that if the warning was genuine, it had already arrived too late. The network was already compromised, and whatever plans the Templars might have harbored for resistance or escape had already been systematically dismantled by silence, or sold off piece by piece. This pattern is not confined to a single voice. Later depositions echo the same unsettling theme. Brother Renaud of Nemours, questioned under oath, stated he believed some among us knew before, but their lips were sealed. Another brother, Mathieu, cried during his initial interrogation that they told us there was time, but there was none. No time, only locks. Even Jacques de Molay himself, in his final testimony, mentioned in passing that we had feared this day, but not so soon. Not so soon, that is the phrase of someone anticipating the axe, yet surprised by its swift descent. Thus, Rouen transforms into a kind of echo chamber, resonating not merely with screams and secrets, but with regret, with missed signals, and with a final, tragic truth, that an order as disciplined and interconnected as the Templars could be undone, not by overt warfare, but by whispers that arrived after the doors had already been secured. This connects back again to the broken seal, the vanishing envoy, the Pope's silent day threads weaving tighter, patterns converging. But this time, the consequences are not theoretical. They bear names, they bleed, they weep behind stone walls. One might inquire, why send a warning at all? Perhaps someone within the Vatican, disquieted by the terms that had been agreed upon, acted surreptitiously. Or perhaps a Templar on the inside chose brotherhood over personal survival. Or, and this is the most disquieting theory, the warning was intentional, yet engineered to fail, a gesture, a means of assuaging conscience, while ensuring the inevitable still occurred. After all, a warning that arrives too late is arguably worse than none, creating just enough hope to shatter something far deeper: trust, brotherhood, and faith. And here, within the Tower of Rouen, all three were brought to their knees. Imagine opening a simple wooden box, lined with faded velvet. It creaks softly, as if hesitant to reveal its contents. There, resting within its cradle of dust and shadow, lies a silver medallion, smooth and worn along its edges, as if frequently handled by fingers uncertain whether to grasp it or let it fall. It bears no inscription, no crest, no lion, cross, crown, or sword, nothing to denote rank or allegiance. Only a shallow indentation in its center, shaped like a circle, interrupted by a single vertical line. Subtle, almost accidental, this artifact was discovered in a Templar crypt beneath a former commandery in southern France, unearthed during a 19th century renovation that was never intended to uncover anything of historical significance. The crypt had been improperly sealed, one stone slab askew. Inside were bones, catalogued without ceremony, and this singular item, the medallion. Initially, it was presumed to be a personal keepsake. However, Templars were forbidden from carrying personal symbols. Their vows were stringent, prohibiting decoration, vanity, or markers of individual glory. Their sole insignia was the red cross, invariably worn on their mantle, never in jewelry or metal. So, what was this object? The metal was analyzed. It was not particularly rare, a standard alloy for the period, yet it bore no tool marks, no engraving, no signature from a known workshop. And then, there was its shape unfamiliar, yet deliberate, that broken circle. One theory suggests it was a symbol employed by a secret faction within the order, a small, clandestine group of Templars who recognized, earlier than most, that the foundations beneath them were shifting. They understood that this impending conflict could not be fought openly, that secrecy now constituted their sole defense. This specific shape, a bisected circle, has no recorded meaning in Templar archives. However, it appears precisely once in the margins of an obscure document housed at the Bibliotheca Apostolica Vaticana, a scribbled diagram accompanying the phrase duo viae, said una exitus, two paths, but one exit. No context, no explanation, merely an ominous pairing of shape and phrase, rendered in a hand that matches no known scribe. If this sounds like the premise of a novel, it is only because the historical facts here are indeed stranger than fiction. This medallion may have belonged to an individual who navigated the fine line between loyalty and survival, a liaison perhaps between the Templars and another authority, be it Vatican, royal, or something less official. It might have served as a sign not of belonging, but of knowing, a badge not intended for public display, but for mutual recognition. What elevates this beyond mere speculation is a passage in a 14th century confessional log preserved within a monastic collection in Lyon. A friar recounts hearing the final confession of an unnamed dying knight, who spoke of a token worn only by the ones who chose neither vow nor crown, a token shown only once, when the doors shut and the silence began. Its vagueness is chilling, yet its specificity in what it emits is profound. Neither vow nor crown, not Templar, not royal, but something distinct, something intermediary. The medallion also oddly resonates with the sealed letter that never reached Cardinal Fredol. The same broken circle appeared in that parchment's marginal notation, too obscure to be coincidence, too precise to disregard. This suggests that whoever crafted this symbol, this quiet emblem of non-allegiance, was present at multiple critical junctures of this historical narrative. And here, the implications become truly strange. When the medallion was first photographed, a historian in Avignon noticed a curious detail. The patina, darkened by age, had worn off in a specific pattern, a groove along the outer edge. Upon closer inspection, it became evident that the medallion had been rotated repeatedly in place, as if utilized in a ritual or as part of a locking mechanism, a key, perhaps, or a token of entrance. This leads to a more provocative theory that the medallion was not merely symbolic, but functional, that it served as proof of membership in a hidden meeting, a physical password not dissimilar to the tokens employed by royal courts to authenticate attendance at secret councils. Present the medallion, gain entry. No name required. This is speculative, of course. Yet, the Templars were logistical masters. They employed invisible ink, encryption, and complex relay systems for letters. Is it so inconceivable that they might have utilized physical tokens for their most sensitive gatherings? If so, then whoever wore this medallion may have stood in the room where the fate of the order was decided, not as an attacker, not as a defender, but as a facilitator. The type of figure who speaks little, nods once, and hands the Pope a page that vanishes before it can be copied. And what of the medallion's ultimate resting place, within a sealed crypt among unmarked bones? Perhaps its owner died shortly after the order's collapse. Perhaps he sought anonymity. Or perhaps he was interred by brethren who did not comprehend the token's meaning, only that it held profound significance. One final thread. In 1354, decades after the Templars' fall, a letter surfaced in England, sent to a minor noble by a former chaplain of the order. It makes an oblique reference to the man with the ringless seal and advises the recipient to trust only those who wear nothing but bear the mark unseen. It is a riddle, a whisper suggesting that some fragmented, liminal portion of the order survived in the shadows. And this medallion, cool and silent, may be the last tangible trace of that fragment. Not a banner, not a cross, but merely a shape, a decision, a door closed, yet not forgotten. The sequence commenced with a cough, not the dramatic, consumptive kind, devoid of blood on linen or gasping into a silk handkerchief. Rather, it was a quiet, persistent clearing of the throat, heard in a dim hallway in Avignon, the sort of symptom a man might disregard, might dismiss, especially if that man were the Pope. However, the cough persisted. By the week's end, Pope Clement V had become almost entirely silent, not metaphorically, but literally. His voice had vanished. Official records from early 1307 contain a conspicuous entry in the Apostolic Registry, noting that due to indisposition, His Holiness is unable to grant oral audience. This condition persisted for several days, possibly over a week. Delegations were postponed, dictations ceased. The papal scriptorium recorded a sudden increase in written briefs, many signed not by Clement but by his secretaries. The intriguing aspect is not that he fell ill. Individuals become sick, particularly in Avignon, where dampness clings to the stone like regret. The curious part is its timing. Immediately after the period of the rumored secret meeting, just after the suspicious gap in the papal diary, and just prior to the sudden alignment of the Vatican and the French crown regarding the Templars, some have posited that the Pope's condition was stress-induced. Clement V, after all, was not a hardened politician. He was a lawyer by training, a negotiator by preference. He had ascended to the papacy through compromise, not conquest. And here he found himself caught between the French king's inexorable demands and the Templars' veiled power. Perhaps his silence was the body's physiological response to moral paralysis, a psychosomatic rebellion. However, others are less charitable in their interpretation. Whispers, always whispers, circulated that his voice was suppressed, not by illness, but by deliberate design that he was silenced. Let us explore this proposition. Accounts from within the papal palace describe his infirmity as sudden and alarming. There was no fever, no lesions, no productive cough, merely a constriction of the throat, a breathy rasp. He was reportedly observed gesturing angrily at his advisors during one closed-door meeting, mouthing words that no one could decipher. His physician, Brother Guillaume de Mella, left no written record of his diagnosis. When questioned decades later, he merely replied that His Holiness recovered in time to act. In time to act, the implication is profoundly unsettling. If Clement's temporary muteness resulted from deliberate poisoning, it would have required intimate access, likely from someone within his inner circle. A tincture slipped into his wine, a mild venom applied to the rim of a chalice. Certain substances known at the time, derived from belladonna, henbane, or aconite, could induce throat swelling or paralysis without fatal effect. Certain apothecaries even specialized in soft silencing for ecclesiastical disputes. But why silence the Pope? Perhaps because he was on the verge of speaking out against the plan. Perhaps because someone feared he would recant whatever had been agreed upon behind closed doors at the secret meeting. A man with power and a conscience is dangerous. A man with power and a sudden inability to speak is manageable. There is another detail that reinforces this theory. During the same time frame, correspondence from Philip IV to Clement became notably assertive. One letter, preserved in partial fragments, begins with the phrase, "Since the matter is now clear to both thrones." The tone is presumptive, almost triumphant, as if the king was no longer requesting action but confirming it, as if the Pope's participation was now a foregone conclusion. And Clement? He did not reply directly. For several days, he wrote nothing at all. Instead, cardinals spoke on his behalf. Decrees were issued by proxy, subtle ones, quiet nudges in protocol, a minor instruction to the Inquisitor's office to prepare additional staff, a request to identify dormant properties once held by the Templars. Nothing overtly accusatory, merely the mechanical tightening of gears. Some have suggested that Clement never intended to fully betray the Templars, that he envisioned a kind of forced retirement for the order, a peaceful disbandment, their reabsorption into the church. But the king desired more. He sought humiliation, he craved blood, and perhaps Clement, hesitant and torn, was afforded no alternative. This returns us to the broader theme. We have been tracing control exerted through covert means, a letter intercepted, a warning delayed, a medallion unseen, and now a voice suppressed. Not an execution, not a coup, but just enough pressure, precisely timed, to alter the course of history. This also elucidates why Clement's later actions appeared so inconsistent. He approved the arrests, yes, but hesitantly. He later absolved the Templar leadership in secret, yet did nothing to prevent their punishment. He lamented the king's cruelty, yet never explicitly condemned it. What if the man simply never fully regained his autonomy? A final, unsettling thought. Among the Vatican's lesser-known medical codices is a brief notation by a monk, physician named Hugo de Dusa. Writing in the 1320 seconds, he reflects on a certain silence that fell upon a great man and the tincture that made it so. No name is mentioned, but he includes the recipe, harmless in small doses, paralyzing in others, and wholly undetectable in burial. Clement V died in 1314, 8 years after the arrests. His body was moved twice before interment. No exhumation has ever been permitted, and so we are left with only this: a pope rendered silent at the precise moment when the order he was meant to protect needed him most. Whether by fear, by poison, or by fate, he could not speak. And in that silence, the sword fell. The monastery of San Ruf stands discreetly just beyond the outskirts of Avignon. It possesses no particular grandeur, neither gilded like the Vatican palaces, nor fortified like the Templar commanderies. It is small, austere. Its stone has weathered into a softness, and its bells toll with a tone that sounds more like a whisper than a summons. Yet, within its cloistered silence, there once resided a monk whose name became paradoxically renowned for what he refused to utter. His name was Brother Mathieu of Arles, a Benedictine scribe and occasional chronicler. In the late winter of 1306, records confirm that Mathieu was briefly summoned to the Papal palace in Avignon. This was not unusual. Benedictines were frequently employed for copying sensitive materials or conveying clerical messages. However, something occurred during that visit, something that compelled him, without fanfare, to never speak again. Not merely about what he witnessed, but about anything at all. The transformation was immediate. He returned to San Ruf the very next morning, offering no farewell, no explanation. From that day forward, Brother Mathieu adopted what his fellow monks termed a vow of perfect silence. The phrase is unusual. No such official Benedictine vow exists. Silence, yes, but not of this absolute severity. Mathieu ceased all vocal communication, not even chanting, not even prayers, communicating solely through nods, gestures, and ink. Initially, his brethren presumed it to be a spiritual crisis, a mystical reaction. However, the abbot, troubled, began to record Mathieu's behavior. He noted that Mathieu kept a small satchel perpetually near his person, never letting it out of his sight. Furthermore, he would sit for hours in the scriptorium, not transcribing scripture, but copying and recopying a single set of pages written in a cipher that no one could decipher. When questioned about it through notes, he merely shook his head. the satchel vanished after his death. Let us revisit the timing. The night Mathieu spent in Avignon aligns almost perfectly with the 24-hour gap in Pope Clement's diary, the very same night that, according to earlier findings, may have encompassed a secret meeting between select Vatican advisors, royal agents, and potentially a Templar envoy. A meeting with no official record and no acknowledged outcome. If Matthew was present, even as a scribe or a quiet observer, it would provide a comprehensive explanation for all subsequent events. But why the silence? Some have speculated that he witnessed a betrayal so profound it shattered him. Others propose he was coerced into silence by oath or by threat, compelled to swear upon something sacred, sealed with a promise more binding than any parchment. Still others wonder if he copied something he could not unsee, a text, a pact, an agreement shrouded in ritual and fear. A single surviving manuscript attributed to Brother Matthew exists today in the archives of Major Abbey. It is neither a gospel nor a liturgical work. It is, inexplicably, a bestiary, a catalogue of animals, both real and imagined. On the surface, it appears innocuous, but in the margins peculiar elements emerge. Creatures labeled with dates, symbols reminiscent of the medallion discovered in the Templar crypt, and one half-erased drawing of two men seated at a long table, a single candle between them, its light casting the shadow of a cross across neither. No names, no explanations, merely imagery that seems out of place, ominously restrained. The monks at San Ruf accepted Brother Matthew's silence, though it disquieted them. He remained dutiful, kind, and present, yet always slightly detached. It was said he bore an expression part wonder, part grief that never left his eyes. He died in the summer of 1312, the same year the Templar order was officially dissolved by papal decree. A coincidence, perhaps, but for the few who still pursue this line of inquiry, it possesses a chilling symmetry. One might inquire if there is conclusive proof of Matthew's presence at the meeting. No formal documentation places him inside the papal chamber that night. However, records of his absence from San Ruf align with the time frame, and a travel receipt issued to a monk of his name was found among the papal household logs, signed and sealed with the Pope's private ring, the same seal that later appears faintly, and with a crack through its center, on the letter that was intercepted and never sent, a quiet signature beneath a louder silence. We must also consider the possibility that Matthew was chosen precisely because he would not divulge what he saw. Some scribes were valued for their discretion as much as their penmanship, and perhaps he was intended to transcribe something that would never again be read a record, not for the archives but for the conscience of a church in transition. If so, then his silence transcends mere absence. It becomes testimony. Silence as resistance, silence as protection, silence as the ultimate barrier between truth and collapse. One might recall the earlier pattern, when the Pope himself lost his voice, when letters went undelivered, when whispers arrived too late. And now, a monk who deliberately chooses never to speak again. This composite paints a stark picture, does it not? A world where the most profound secrets are preserved not through clamor but through carefully cultivated gaps, a sentence left unfinished, a name unspoken, a vow made not in ink but in the empty space between words. And at the epicenter of it all, Brother Mathieu of Arles, the monk who would not speak, who refused to bear witness, because perhaps, just perhaps, what he saw that night was never meant to survive in audible form. The ledger appears unremarkable at first, a list of financial transfers, columned by date and destination, some entries noted in the cramped hand of a clerk preoccupied more with arithmetic than with posterity. However, one line in particular compels attention, not for its content, but for its abrupt termination. The ledger simply ends. The entry is dated January 1307 and records a substantial withdrawal from the account of Amato del Leone, a banker of Lombard origin operating discreetly in Avignon. The withdrawal is labeled displacement of reserves, a vague term in any century. Following this, there is no continuation, no subsequent entry, no next page. The ledger itself was never resumed. According to tax records, Amato del Leone vanished in the first week of February. His house was shuttered, his staff dispersed. The municipal clerk noted that he left no debts, yet also no forwarding address or instructions. It was as if he merely stepped out of his counting room, closed the door, and evaporated. Yet, bankers do not simply vanish, not in that era, and certainly not without considerable notice. In Avignon at the time, Lombard bankers occupied a unique position, simultaneously powerful and largely invisible. They functioned as the financial arteries of the church, discreet operators who understood the inherent value of secrecy in a world that trafficked in both gold and gilt. Amato was particularly well regarded, known for his discretion and his unwavering refusal to engage in the more speculative temptations of his trade. He was, in essence, the kind of man one could trust to quietly facilitate the disappearance of large sums. So, why did he himself disappear? Here, the narrative becomes intricate. A few months later, in early summer, the Templar arrests had commenced in earnest. Across France, knights were forcibly removed from their beds, their manors sealed, their records seized. However, not a single record of Templar accounts was found in Avignon. The Templar accounts there had been settled, balanced, and closed no sudden absences, no unaccounted funds, as if they had been forewarned. This brings us back to Amato. Several obscure references suggest he acted as an intermediary, not solely between the Templars and the Vatican, but also between rival factions within both institutions. He possessed the singular ability to orchestrate a discreet transfer between a monastic order and a crown without alerting a single scribe. A courier, once apprehended in Montpellier, claimed to have delivered a sealed satchel to Amato's residence containing documents for dissolution. When questioned, he insisted the package bore both a red wax seal and a fragment of gold ribbon, the same type utilized in the Pope's private correspondence. Naturally, the satchel was never recovered. In a letter dated 3 years after the Templars' fall, a former royal treasurer mentions Amato by name. He writes, almost in passing, the Lombard, who was clever enough to see the tide turning, removed himself with grace. He saw the map redrawing. That particular phrase, the map redrawing, has become a form of shorthand among certain historians, suggesting that some individuals understood not merely that something was ending, but what would subsequently emerge in its place. And then there is the artifact. In 1882, a small bronze box was unearthed in a walled-up cellar beneath a merchant house in Avignon. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, were coins, receipts, and one folded parchment bearing the seal of a Templar preceptor in Provence. The document contained no body text, only a salutation to the trusted hand who parts the sea. Historians debated its meaning, a poetic flourish, a cryptic code, but the timing aligns. The house belonged to Amato. One can almost envision the scene, a man with too many keys and too few allegiances, a knock at the door in the cold hours before dawn, a conversation held in whispers, a ledger closed not due to error, but due to finality. Perhaps Amato assisted in orchestrating a portion of the collapse, not the betrayal itself, but the underlying scaffolding, the financial logistics of a deal too perilous to ever surface. Perhaps he was compensated to ensure that certain accounts were emptied without arousing suspicion. Perhaps he facilitated the funneling of assets to safe havens before the fall. Or perhaps he simply discerned the signs, the sealed letters, the papal silence, the way certain men no longer met his gaze, and decided it was time to depart before his discretion transformed into a liability. It is the silences that reverberate most profoundly here. No arrest, no trial, no property seizure, merely absence. And within that void, the unmistakable outline of someone who knew too much to remain. There is also the matter of a final notation, scrolled in Latin in the margin of a separate ledger discovered decades later in Genoa. It reads, "A man must know when the ship is wood and when it is fire. No signature, no context. but the entry is dated 1307 and written in a hand almost identical to one found in Amato's surviving correspondences. A warning, or perhaps a farewell. His trail concludes in silence. No record of death, no inheritance claimed, but the clues left behind strongly suggest that Amato did not merely vanish, he chose to dissolve. And that choice to disappear precisely when silence became currency may be the reason so little of the Templars' vast financial network was ever recovered. They had, it seems, someone on the inside, someone who understood that treasure is not always gold. Sometimes it is information, and sometimes the most valuable asset of all is knowing when to withdraw before the storm breaks. The Inquisition possessed numerous instruments: fire, parchment, and iron. However, its most incisive tool was invariably timing. It is easy to conceive of the Inquisition as a relentless, ceaselessly grinding machine, merciless and uninterrupted, and in most instances, this perception holds true. The machinery of ecclesiastical justice, once activated, rarely paused. Yet, in the months following the rumored secret meeting in Avignon, an unusual phenomenon occurred: a delay. Despite escalating accusations, burgeoning street rumors, and increasing pressure from the French crown, the Inquisition's apparatus hesitated. For weeks after Pope Clement and King Philip allegedly reached some unspoken agreement, no summons were issued, no trials commenced. The Vatican's tribunals, typically swift to act in the face of suspected heresy, remained conspicuously quiet. To a casual observer, this might have suggested uncertainty. Perhaps Rome was carefully weighing its options, or perhaps the Pope awaited further substantiating proof. However, those intimately familiar with the operational tempo of papal justice perceived something more peculiar: preparation, devoid of action. Behind closed doors, the system meticulously readied itself. Tribunal seats were arranged, inquisitors were reassigned, additional scribes were summoned to key bishops, and monastic libraries were purged of potentially contradictory texts. Yet, the hammer did not fall. Not yet. Why this gap, this interlude, has become one of the most vigorously debated silences in the history of the Templars' downfall. If Clement had already assented to Philip's plan, why did the Vatican hesitate to deploy its most infamous instrument? Some believe the delay was strategic, that following the secret meeting, the Vatican required time to orchestrate a narrative that would appear legitimate, to construct a framework wherein betrayal could be perceived as justice. This necessitated more than mere logistics. It demanded meticulous choreography. Testimonies had to be shaped, evidence aligned. The public required preparation not solely through fear, but through subtle suggestion. Scribes were instructed to circulate prior accusations against the Templars, some dating back decades, most of which had long been dismissed. Ancient murmurs of idolatry, strange rituals, and unnatural vows were resurrected, like specters emerging from the catacombs. Yet, still, no formal inquisition was initiated. It was not until after Philip IV commanded the mass arrest of the Templars in October 1307 that the gears truly began to turn. Only then, when the knights were already shackled, did the Vatican finally dispatch its inquisitors. This reversal of traditional protocol crown preceding church was unprecedented. Conventionally, the church brought accusations, and the crown enforced them. However, in this instance, Philip acted first, and Rome followed. This suggests either that Clement was coerced into compliance, or that he was complicit in a broader strategy that necessitated plausible deniability. If we return to the concept of a secret meeting, a covert agreement between throne and altar, then the Vatican's delay assumes a grim logic. The Inquisition had to wait, not because it was unprepared, but because its readiness needed to appear reluctant. This also connects to the earlier disappearance of Brother Amory, the Templar emissary who vanished after his alleged audience with the Pope. If he carried messages warning of the arrests, it might have been the Vatican's sustained silence, rather than its explicit pronouncements, that ultimately sealed the order's fate. Consider this. Several inquisitorial manuals from the period emphasize the importance of judicious timing in the punishment of heresy, not for fairness, but for maximal effect. A protracted accusation grants the accused sufficient time to rally support. A sudden strike, conversely, fosters confusion and enforces immediate obedience. The most chilling clue emerges from an internal Vatican memorandum discovered in the archives of Narbonne, penned by a subordinate notary to his superior. It advises, hold proceedings until the Crown has made visible the offences. Let the Church act only once the rot is seen. This represents a strategy of calculated obfuscation. Permit the damage to be inflicted, then intervene as the moral custodian. We can also examine the testimony of Guillaume de Paris, the royal confessor and Philip IV's personal inquisitor. During his interrogation of imprisoned Templars, he alluded to a greater plan that had been discussed with Rome and under God. Yet, nowhere in the official records does such a plan appear, a plan that exists only in marginal notes and whispers. This pause also resonates with the medallion lacking insignia, an artifact of silence, of action unclaimed. It echoes the Pope's lost voice, Brother Matthew's vow, and the missing monk from Mont Saint-Michel, whose absence was never officially acknowledged. Collectively, these moments form a persistent motif. The delay in the Inquisition's action was not a lapse, it was a deliberate decision, a signal that the institutions purportedly designed to safeguard against unchecked power had, instead, become participants in its intricate choreography. Even the language employed in subsequent papal bulls is cautiously phrased, as if retracting steps into certainty. Words such as alleged, grave suspicion, and perceived corruption carefully circumvent explicit accusations of heresy. It is almost as if Clement sought to retain the option of retreat until it was irrevocably too late to do so. And when the Inquisition finally mobilized, it did so with brutal precision. No second chances, no deviations. The apparatus, having waited, sprang forward like a meticulously baited trap. The silence had served its purpose. It is imperative to reflect on the meaning of silence in a world constructed upon spoken rights and written law. To defer judgment is to reshape history. To knowingly await while a tide of falsehood gains momentum constitutes a form of complicity, a quiet betrayal. And in the Vatican's deliberate inaction, we discover not mercy, but strategic calculation, a gap born not of uncertainty, but of intricate coordination. The Church did not strike first, but it ensured the strike would be enduring. The events commenced as fires often do in the quietest hours of the night. The papal archivist on duty reportedly first detected it a faint scent of smoke, intermingled with damp parchment and candle wax. Then came the glow, initially soft, like the nascent light of sunrise filtering through stained glass. Yet, this was neither sun nor sacred radiance. It was flame, escalating rapidly. The fire erupted in the restricted wing of the Avignon archives in early spring, 1308, merely months after the coordinated arrests of the Templars had astonished Europe. The official cause was recorded as a candle left unattended by a novice scribe, a minor error exacerbated by the dry winter air and the highly flammable nature of centuries-old vellum. No lives were lost, but the records perished, specifically a stack of documents spanning a narrow time frame from mid-December 1306 to late February 1307. These dates, one might recognize, correspond almost precisely to the period of the alleged secret meeting, the enigmatic 24-hour gap in Pope Clement's itinerary, the sudden shift in royal policy, the disappearance of the Templar envoy, Brother Amory, and the Pope's abrupt muteness. In essence, the fire appeared to target the exact historical juncture around which this investigation has gravitated. Officially, it was classified as an accident, a regrettable loss. A few scrolls and a dozen parchments, stated the Vatican, nothing of major consequence. However, those employed within the archives knew otherwise. Several of the destroyed items had recently been requested for review by high-ranking clergy. One bore the Pope's personal seal. Another was rumored to be a draft of a papal bull that was never issued. This was not a random pile, it was a curated dossier. Furthermore, there is the peculiar conduct of the archivist himself. Brother Jean de Castor, who managed that specific wing, departed Avignon 2 weeks after the fire. Voluntarily, but abruptly, he retired to a remote priory near the Rhône, where he reportedly adopted beekeeping, a quiet end to a quiet career. Decades later, however, a fragment of parchment was discovered tucked inside the binding of a psalter, believed to be his personal copy. It bore a single Latin phrase: "Ignis non delet pactum." Fire does not erase a pact. The Vatican dismissed it as metaphor, but those conversant with the context hear something else, a warning or perhaps a confession. Let us pause to consider the extent of what was lost. Among the items consumed were a copy of the daily registry from the papal residence, 2 sealed letters bearing royal wax impressions, a log of visitors to Benedictine hostels in Avignon, and an unsigned draft bearing the heading Compendium Pro Ordinis Militiae Templi. The last is particularly tantalizing. The title suggests a summary of deliberations concerning the Templar order. It might have been innocuous, or it might have been a written account of that which had, until then, existed solely as rumor, a deal, a compromise, a whispered sacrifice. Some historians have endeavored to reconstruct the contents based on references in later documents, a passing mention in a cardinal's diary, a complaint by a Franciscan scribe about lost minutes, a note in the margin of a 1310 theological commentary. This argument has already been settled, as was agreed in the winter meeting. That phrase, winter meeting, appears nowhere else in ecclesiastical records. Coincidence is always a possibility, but then again, so is deliberate design. This fire was not the sole archival blaze of the period. A smaller one erupted in Béziers, destroying local diocesan records from the same year. Another flared in a minor monastic library in Poitiers, incinerating letters between a bishop and a Templar preceptor. All were attributed to accidents: candles, lightning, unwatched hearths. One might recall earlier investigative threads: the intercepted letter with the broken seal, the banker who vanished without a trace, the monk who swore silence rather than speak of what he had witnessed. Each moment, viewed in isolation, might seem like mere background noise. However, in sequence, they form a kind of choreography, a pervasive pattern of erasure. The fire in Avignon was perhaps the most literal act within that sequence, an attempt not merely to obscure, but to incinerate. There is another complexity. Contemporary sources indicate that several of the destroyed scrolls had recently been relocated from the papal study, not because they were intrinsically dangerous, but because they were deemed too sensitive for ongoing inquiry. This phrasing originates from a surviving log in the outer archives. It implies knowledge, intent. These documents were not forgotten, they were specifically identified, and someone, it seems, ensured they would never again be read. It is tempting to imagine a saboteur, a rogue monk, armed with flint and a mission. More plausibly, however, this constituted administrative sabotage, a bureaucratic execution carried out under the guise of routine, perhaps even orchestrated from above. And yet, fire proves to be an imperfect editor. It often consumes what it should not. One document, partially scorched, survived in fragments. It was later meticulously reconstructed in the Vatican's Cottes Salvati. Its final line remains legible: to do nothing is to decide. Let the record perish, again unsigned, again suspiciously timed. We have discussed silence, disappearance, and delay. But this fire was distinct. This was not absence, this was removal. A purge, not of individuals, but of memory. In the shadowy history of the Templars' fall, numerous gaps exist. But some gaps are profoundly darker than others. Some are not mere holes in the record, but holes intentionally burned, clean and final. And so, we we sit before this empty shelf where 12 parchments once rested, listening to the faint echo of crackling vellum curling in on itself, carrying with it secrets that no trial would ever name. The storm did not manifest with thunder. It commenced with a silence so deliberate that it could almost be mistaken for calm. In the weeks preceding the mass arrests of the Knights Templar in October 1307, France did not resemble a kingdom preparing for war against one of Christendom's most powerful military orders. There were no public declarations, no proclamations of heresy, no sermons warning of the devil cloaked in white. Instead, there was administrative activity, quiet orders, subtle reshuffling, officials moving through towns with sealed scrolls and downcast eyes. In essence, there was extensive coordination, but an eerie absence of noise. This profound quietude baffles historians. For an operation of such magnitude, a sweep involving thousands of knights across hundreds of commanderies, there is a startling lack of the usual precursors. No records of legal proceedings being drafted, no public debates among royal councillors. Even the French nobility, many of whom maintained long-standing relationships with the Templars, appeared blindsided. How does a kingdom prepare to arrest an entire order in near total silence? One possibility lies in efficiency. Philip IV was not a flamboyant ruler, but a calculating one. His court was built upon bureaucratic precision. He had meticulously restructured France's legal apparatus to serve his ambitions, and had positioned loyal clerks in key administrative roles, the kind of ruler capable of weaponizing paperwork with the same efficacy as steel. Yet, even Philip could not act entirely unilaterally. He required the Church's support, or at the very least, its silence. And this is where the Vatican's peculiar delay becomes pertinent. For while Rome hesitated, France meticulously prepared. One of the initial indicators appears in a mundane report from the Royal Chancery in early September. A request was made for updated inventories of ecclesiastical prisons, primarily minor abbeys with unused holding cells. No explanation was provided. The request was merely filed under logistical foresight. Shortly thereafter, the French Treasury recorded several bulk purchases of parchment, wax seals, and chains. These too were quietly noted. However, the most telling clue is human. A man named Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip's iron-fisted minister, began making sudden, unannounced visits to regional bailies in late August. There were no summons, no open meetings. He would arrive, whisper instructions, and depart. Witnesses later recalled that these visits frequently resulted in clerks receiving sealed orders not to be opened until a specific date, October 12th. Inside these orders were detailed instructions for the arrest of the Templars, complete with names, addresses, and lists of items to seize. How these documents were prepared so far in advance remains an enigma, particularly since the public charges were not officially articulated until later. The Templars themselves seemed entirely unaware. As late as early October, they were observed openly conducting business, lending money, holding mass, hosting nobles. There are no reports of sudden movements, no hoarding of supplies, no bolting of gates. It is as if they suspected nothing, unless, of course, some did. Recall the earlier whispers within the Tower of Ruin concerning warnings that arrived too late, or the banker Amato del Leone, who vanished in the weeks preceding the arrests. These fragments form a puzzle, suggesting that certain individuals possessed foreknowledge that something was imminent, though perhaps not the precise nature, timing, or scope of the impending events. Now, consider the fact that in several key locations, Paris, Toulouse, Reims, the local royal officials had already drafted Templar property claims before the arrests even commenced. This implies not merely foreknowledge of guilt, but of an inevitable outcome. These officials were not simply prepared for seizure, they were anticipating inheritance. This leads to a darker possibility. What if the silence was not merely strategic but ceremonial? Rare references in medieval political thought allude to the concept of the hollow verdict, a punishment rendered in quietude, so that when it is finally pronounced, it arrives fully formed, undeniable, almost divine. the silence becomes an intrinsic part of the performance. It cultivates the illusion that the world itself has passed judgment, not merely human agents. We have previously observed this silence in the Pope's voiceless days, in Brother Matthew's vow, in the Vatican's delayed inquisitions. And now, in the days preceding the raids, it expanded to encompass an entire kingdom, a meticulously orchestrated hush, pregnant with impending violence. This aligns with a minor but frequently overlooked incident, recorded by a notary in Orleans. He recounts that the night before the arrests, a local priest reported observing a royal official burying a sealed chest beneath the chapel floor. When asked about its contents, the official replied only, "To be opened if they resist." The chest was never recovered. However, perhaps the most chilling detail of all is found not in a document, but in a silence even more profound than those previously noted. In the week preceding the arrests, the bells of Notre Dame de Paris were not rung at Vespers. The reason remains unrecorded: no holiday, no mourning, no weather event, merely a missing toll. One might dismiss this as coincidence. Yet, in medieval Paris, bells represented the city's heartbeat. For them to cease unannounced is not insignificant. It is the sound of held breath, the calm before the blade. And when the morning of October 13th arrived, the blade descended swift, total, unavoidable. The Templars, once so deeply entrenched in every corner of France, were caught entirely off guard, as if the world had inexplicably turned against them overnight. But in truth, the world had already turned. The silence had merely concealed its rotation. What is more terrifying than thunder? The moment just preceding it, when the sky seemingly forgets to breathe, when one realizes the storm is not merely approaching, it has already arrived. Such was France in the autumn of 1307, not unprepared, but profoundly, deliberately quiet. An entire section, dated late September to early October 1307, meticulously outlines transactions that are anything but routine. 24 saddles were ordered without accompanying horses. A shipment of iron bars, not coin, was delivered to an undisclosed location outside Carcassonne. And an unusual phrase is repeated 4 times in the margins. In nocte parati sumus, we are ready in the night. Ready for what? The dates, once again, are critical. These entries appear mere days before the Templar arrests on October 13th. The Bézier's commandery, though small, was evidently mobilizing. But mobilizing for what specific purpose? Escape? Resistance? Or something altogether different? The Black Book offers no explicit explanations, only further questions. One curious entry lists payment for a wagon secured against fire and stone. Another refers to sealed bundles for the river road. The handwriting in these later pages shifts, appearing more rushed, more cautious. One entry concludes abruptly mid-word, as if the writer was interrupted. It is conceivable that these are merely logistical notations for routine movement of goods. However, the surrounding context casts significant doubt. Why label candles and rope as prepared stock for dissolution? Why were so many items marked, not with names or locations, but with enigmatic symbols? An upside-down cross, a broken sun, a crescent within a square. We have encountered symbols previously. The unmarked medallion discovered in a Templar crypt, the drawings in Brother Matthew's bestiary, the peculiar seal on the lost Chinon command. A distinct language exists here, designed to obscure meaning while simultaneously communicating to those with privileged knowledge. And then, at the very end of the book, on the inside of the back cover, a single phrase is inscribed in larger, bolder letters: Ad pactum servandum ignoramus. To preserve the pact, we prefer fire. This is chilling, not solely for its fatalism, but for its resonance with other evidence. Recall the scorched archives in Avignon and the marginal comment from Brother Jean de Casta: fire does not erase a pact. These are not isolated flourishes. They are integral to a pattern, a form of internal doctrine. The Black Book may have functioned as a manual, not merely a ledger, a guide for Templar cells anticipating the Order's destruction, detailing procedures for swift dismantling, burial, and incineration. And it raises a critical question. How far in advance did they possess this knowledge? We have traced numerous signs indicative of a sudden betrayal, a coordinated ambush. However, the Black Book suggests that at least some Templars perceived the impending shadow and received a warning, perhaps unofficial, perhaps whispered from behind a mitred veil, and acted accordingly. This would explain why, in several regions, Templar properties yielded surprisingly little upon seizure. Gold vaults discovered empty, records missing, horses relocated, preceptories abandoned. It would also explain the arrest reports from Béziers itself. According to royal documents, the Béziers commandery was found devoid of all primary officers. Only 2 young initiates were apprehended, both professing ignorance of any wrongdoing. The preceptor, his lieutenant, and the chief scribe all had vanished in the night. The arresting officer described the scene as eerily tidy. No struggle, no disorder, merely the distinct impression that something had been swiftly and intentionally moved. And now we know, thanks to this unassuming little book, that it was. What renders the Black Book so invaluable is not that it conclusively proves a conspiracy, but that it unequivocally demonstrates readiness. The Order was not entirely caught unawares. At least one cell was preparing for collapse, perhaps even instructed to do so. This points to internal communication, possibly from high levels, which in turn suggests that even as the papacy and the French crown coordinated the Templars' demise, someone within the Order was endeavoring to mitigate the damage. Whether that individual was Jacques de Molay himself, another Grand Visitor, or a splinter group operating in the shadows, may forever remain unknown. But the evidence is now irrefutable. Someone lit the fuse, and someone else prepared the buckets of sand. The Black Book also serves as a crucial link to the quiet tension explored in earlier chapters, the silence of the Inquisition, the fire that eliminated inconvenient evidence, the banker who vanished just prior to the fall. This modest ledger, concealed within the dusty remnants of a forgotten chapel, bridges the personal and the institutional. It connects whispers to logistical operations. It reveals that secrets are not merely hidden, they are meticulously planned. And ultimately, perhaps that is the most profound revelation of all. The Templars did not simply perish. They folded deliberately, quietly, with pre-established protocols, checklists, and coded phrases that only acquire meaning once the rising flames have already been discerned. It appears unremarkable initially, a brittle manuscript, perhaps 20 pages long, its vellum slightly yellowed, its edges frayed. The cover bears no crest, no date, no signature. In a dimly lit room, it would readily pass for any other ecclesiastical note, a forgotten devotional, a lost sermon, perhaps even a confession. However, under ultraviolet light, something distinct emerges, a ghost of a sentence barely perceptible to the naked eye, yet undeniable under the correct wavelength. The ink, once vibrant, has faded, not through natural aging, but through deliberate intent. Whoever inscribed it did not intend for it to endure eternally. They wished it to whisper, and then to vanish. The fragment reads, "The Knights have agreed to dissolve, provided." And then the line abruptly breaks a tear in the page, a smear of wax, a void. This is the so-called Avignon manuscript, discovered in a private collection in the late 19th century, misfiled among decorative bookplates and ecclesiastical poetry. The collector, a retired French notary with an astute eye for curiosities, possessed no inkling of the treasure he held. It was not until decades later, when preservationists began scanning the manuscript using nascent ultraviolet techniques, that the hidden text came to light. The line has haunted historians ever since, not for what it explicitly states, but for what it almost states. The Knights have agreed to dissolve, provided what? Safe passage? Immunity for leaders? A transfer of wealth? Silence in exchange for survival? We cannot definitively ascertain, but the implications are staggering. If genuine, The sentence suggests that the order's demise was not merely a blunt act of betrayal, but a negotiation, a deal brokered behind velvet curtains, not surrender, but a calculated transaction. The manuscript itself contains layers of intrigue. Even without the invisible line, its pages provoke scrutiny. The language is formal, but hesitant. Latin structured like a legal draft, yet featuring peculiar gaps where clauses should reside. One paragraph trails off mid-sentence, and the subsequent one begins with a capital letter lacking an antecedent. It is as if the document served as a placeholder, a preliminary sketch, something intended for finalization but never completed. And the physical details deepen the mystery. The parchment bears traces of gold thread binding, indicative of high status or papal use. The ink, at least what remains visible, is a blend found exclusively in high chancel scribal works, likely reserved for confidential communications. Even more curious, the manuscript was folded tightly, as if concealed inside a sleeve or sewn into a lining. This was not a document intended for routine storage. It was a message intended for clandestine movement. Scholars now suspect it was a draft, an early iteration of an agreement never formally enacted, but perhaps utilized as the foundation for verbal negotiations. It may have been briefly displayed, read by flickering candlelight, then secreted away for safekeeping until someone, fearing its contents, applied a fading agent to the ink, chemically engineered to degrade under light and time. Why not destroy it outright? Because outright erasure engenders suspicion, whereas decay cultivates doubt. And in the political landscape of Avignon, doubt was frequently more advantageous than unvarnished truth. We have observed similar strategies previously: the fire that consumed select Vatican archives, the vanished banker who orchestrated quiet exits, the Templar ledger from Béziers, replete with cryptic references to dissolution. This manuscript resonates with all of them, suggesting that the collapse of the Templars was not a singular, decisive blow, but a meticulously choreographed series of acts, each leaving behind just enough evidence to suggest intent, but insufficient to prove it unequivocally. Naturally, skeptics exist. Some contend that the disappearing ink was a later addition, perhaps part of a 16th century forgery. However, the parchment has been carbon dated to within 10 years of 1307, and the ink, though altered, exhibits the chemical signature of gallnut compounds utilized in the papal chancery during that precise period. More tellingly still, a fragmentary inventory of papal correspondences from 1307 includes an entry listed simply as intent to suppress, confidential, unwitnessed. No author, no destination, merely that enigmatic phrase. The archivist's notation was added in haste. The original document has never been located, but some believe the Avignon manuscript is that very document. And if so, it raises profoundly troubling questions, because if a deal was drafted, even covertly, then someone, either the Pope, the King, or a senior figure within the order, was willing to trade the institution for something else: power, peace, safety, or silence. A moral ambiguity pervades this historical juncture, lingering across the centuries. The Templars have long been characterized as either martyrs or monsters. But what if they were something far more human? Survivors, negotiators, active participants in their own erasure. One phrase from an unrelated letter now seems unexpectedly resonant in light of this manuscript. A cardinal in Avignon wrote in a personal note to his brother, "They bowed not from fear, but from the weight of knowledge." This may have referred to the Templars, or to someone else entirely, but the underlying theme is clear. Everyone knew something momentous was approaching. This document, hidden and intentionally faded, does not definitively prove a conspiracy, but it irrefutably demonstrates expectation. It proves preparation. It proves that before the arrests, the fires, and the trials, someone attempted to establish terms. And in that act, we glimpse the true nature of the betrayal, not in the ensuing violence, but in the compromise that preceded it. The specific words were never spoken aloud, not in council, not in chapel, not even whispered within the cloisters. They were committed to writing, recited once, and then sealed. It was designated Sacrificium Pro Unitatis Rei, though few knew it by that name. A papal bull was issued, not for public dissemination, but for a select circle of high-ranking clergy, delivered in duplicate, but never formally published. The Vatican would later refer to it only obliquely as a private matter concerning ecclesial political harmony. However, among those who received it, it became known by another name, the Oath of Avignon. It emerged from the shadows decades later in the personal archive of a minor Spanish bishop. His family had preserved the parchment as an heirloom, passing it down like a reliquary, folded tightly and wrapped in cloth. The document bears Clement V's seal, faded but intact. The ink is dense, the phrasing meticulously careful. It reads not as a decree, but as an understanding, a compact framed in sacrificial language and diplomatic ambiguity. It commences with a premise both elegant and chilling. Where unity falters, sacrifice must stitch the breach. From this point, the bull outlines a theological justification for compromising with temporal power. It discusses the necessity of safeguarding Europe's holy structure from collapse and warns of an emerging tide of disintegration, attributing blame neither to heretics nor to enemies, but to the excessive independence of martial orders. Nowhere does it explicitly mention the Knights Templar, yet the subtext is unequivocally clear. The order is the subject even in its absence. The bull proceeds to assert that an accord must be reached whereby both crown and crozier are satisfied, and offers that if an offering must be made to preserve unity, let that offering be cloaked in righteousness, not vengeance. In other words, let it possess the appearance of holiness, even if its underlying nature is not. One line in particular stands out. Should the knights agree to stand down, the Church shall not pursue them further. This constitutes a conditional promise, or perhaps a signal, a backroom offer. This aligns eerily well with the vanishing ink manuscript previously examined, which read, "The knights have agreed to dissolve, provided." Now, we discern the other side of that phrase, a papal assurance, a secret vow. It also casts new light on Pope Clement's peculiar silence following the alleged meeting with King Philip. If this oath was indeed formulated during that gap in his itinerary, the same gap that witnessed the disappearance of Brother Amory, the Pope's subsequent illness, and the suspicious shift in royal policy, then it emerges as the linchpin in a coordinated betrayal, a betrayal adorned in velvet, scented with incense. Scholars have long grappled with the bull's unusual tone. It does not read as law, it reads as diplomacy. There is no thunder, no condemnation of heresy, no damnation. Instead, it offers carefully chosen phrasing, theological cushions, and an almost apologetic cadence. One passage even appears to lament what must be done. Let those who must perish do so quietly, for they perish not from sin, but from necessity. This line has elicited endless commentary. Necessity, according to whom? For King Philip, the necessity was financial. The crown was deeply indebted to the Templars, and perceived in their dissolution a path to solvency. For Clement, perhaps the necessity was survival. His position was already precarious, caught between France's powerful crown and the Roman Curia's expectations. To defy Philip could have resulted in exile, or worse. Thus, he acquiesced, not publicly, but privately, with soft ink and sealed parchment, utilizing the language of unity. And herein lies the genius and the horror of the Oath of Avignon. It was conceived not as a command, but as a justification, a moral pretext, a mirror for future generations to gaze into and discern whatever they desired. Justice, if that was their need. Complicity, if they dared to see it. Consider this within the context of the pervasive silence uncovered throughout this investigation. The Vatican's delay in deploying inquisitors, the coordinated arrests, the missing records, the coded phrases in the Black Book of Béziers, the precise timing of every event. These elements form a lattice, a web within which this oath resides at the very center. There is also a tantalizing addendum on the reverse page of the document, a handwritten marginal note, likely added by one of the cardinal recipients. It reads, "Let no one speak of this before the third seal breaks." No one has definitively interpreted this cryptic line. Some believe it refers to the breaking of 3 ecclesiastical seals on a related document. Others suspect it alludes to apocalyptic prophecy, specifically the third seal of the Book of Revelation, which portends scarcity and imbalance, a world thrust into negotiation. However, perhaps its meaning is simpler, a warning, not yet, and so the oath remained silent. Its recipients did not debate it, they obeyed. The Pope did not retract it, he retreated into ambiguity. The world, witnessing the Templars' downfall, assumed it was divine judgment. But behind the altar, in a locked chamber in Avignon, the judgment had already been rendered quietly, elegantly, and without witnesses. The Templars may have been courageous. They may even have been innocent. But above all, they were inconvenient. And in a world where power was precariously balanced between throne and altar, inconvenience was rarely permitted to endure. They were not intended to scrutinize so closely. In the late 15th century, nearly 2 centuries after the fall of the Templars, a young Vatican archivist named Father Antonio Luciani was assigned a tedious yet prestigious task to catalogue the older ledgers of the Avignon papacy. A scholar with a penchant for marginalia and a fondness for ecclesiastical law, Luciani approached the assignment with seriousness, perhaps a little too seriously for the preferences of his superiors. What he discovered was not shocking in its explicit content, but profoundly suggestive in its implications. A slim, dust-caked ledger, misfiled under Curia Miscellaneous, contained entries for items moved into deep storage sometime around the year 1308. Most were routine: ceremonial vestments, old coinage dies, a cracked crucifix from Avignon. However, the final item captured his attention. The line simply read, "One register of suppressed deliberations, not to be indexed." Luciani, intrigued by the phrasing, noted the item in his catalogue, appending a quiet Latin phrase in the margin, "Negotium in tenebris quin destructio ordinis," the quiet negotiation that destroyed the order. That single sentence, scribbled almost casually in faded ink, would remain unnoticed until the early 20th century, when the Vatican granted limited access to previously sealed sections of its archives. A visiting Jesuit historian encountered Luciani's catalogue and highlighted that cryptic phrase. He authored an article about it, a modest piece in a theological journal, but it caught the attention of researchers already pursuing whispers of the Templars' downfall. What could a 15th century archivist possibly have known about a negotiation that transpired 2 centuries prior? And more importantly, how? There are no known records in the primary papal bulls that describe a formal agreement between the Templars and the Church. No proclamations, no confessions, no evidence of a legal compromise. Yet, Luciani's phrasing is too specific to dismiss. He does not refer to accusations, heresy, or confession. He speaks of negotiation, he speaks of quiet. Some believe Luciani possessed access to documents no longer extant. Others suspect he absorbed information from the whispers within the archive halls, stories passed down by custodians who had read things, handled things, been told things during long, candlelit nights when the air smelled of mold, dust, and history. Still, others believe Luciani was referring not to a single document, but to a pervasive pattern. A trail of cross-referenced whispers, bulls written but never published, ledgers listing missing items, seals without accompanying text, a kind of absented presence, a shadow of a decision rather than the decision itself. The vaults themselves reinforce this impression. Even today, several boxes from the Avignon period are marked confidential or condition unknown. Some have never been opened in modern times. Whether this is due to preservation issues or institutional caution remains unclear. However, When considering the meticulousness with which the Vatican catalogues even the most minor indulgences and saintly relics, the gaps begin to glow with significance. Luciani's Marginalia connects us once again to the Black Book of Béziers and the vanished manuscript with disappearing ink. Taken together, these items form a constellation of implication. Each on its own is inconclusive, but when aligned, they hint at something long suspected, that the Templars did not fall overnight, and not without an agreement, and agreements invariably leave traces. There is another echo in the vaults worth considering. A brief, almost poetic entry in a clerical diary from 1324, penned by a papal assistant who served under both Clement V and his successor. He writes, "What was broken was not only the sword, but the silence, and yet the silence returned." That line has been quoted, debated, and embellished for generations. But what if it was more than a metaphor? What if it referred to the brief moment when the truth threatened to surface, when voices rose within the Vatican, when someone almost revealed too much, and then the seal was set again? Secrecy in the Vatican is not merely policy, it is theology, it is architecture. Secrets are embedded in the mortar. They reverberate in the vaults, not with sound, but with space, with gaps in the shelves, misfiled records, and boxes that remain permanently closed. If a negotiation indeed took place, if, as Luciani suggests, the Templars were offered a conditional dissolution in exchange for peace, then the silence that followed would have been an integral part of the pact. A mutual forgetting, not signed, not archived, only understood. And that understanding is what we continue to pursue, because even now, the vaults echo, not with confessions, not with shouts, but with the soft rustle of parchment, the gentle sigh of drawers opening on empty folders, the nearly imperceptible pause before a catalogue jumps from one date to another without explanation. That silence, it is not absence, it is design. It is the kind of silence that materializes only after a decision has been made, when there is nothing more to articulate and everything remaining to be forgotten. The Chinon parchment, a rare artifact that evaded the ravages of fire, war, and collective forgetfulness, only to re-emerge centuries later, bearing the immense weight of a kingdom's secrets pressed into its creases, is widely known. Discovered in 2001 within the Vatican secret archives, misfiled under a heading that translates to penitential matters, the parchment initially appeared to fundamentally alter our understanding. It records the absolution of the Templar leadership by Pope Clement V himself, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay, following a private inquiry conducted at the fortress of Chinon in 1308. For many, this constituted confirmation that the Church never truly believed the Templars were heretics, a surprising twist, a vindication. Yet, the deeper one reads, the more complex it becomes. For the Chinon parchment is not a declaration of innocence, it is an agreement, a calibration, a recalibration of guilt, meticulously orchestrated in quiet corners to placate an uneasy alliance between the Pope and the Crown. The document is surprisingly clinical. It neither condemns the Templars nor proclaims them blameless. It acknowledges the existence of certain rites and behaviors, secret rituals, improper kisses, obscured intentions, but frames them as misunderstandings. It offers forgiveness for these errors, describing them not as sins, but as lapses brought on by isolation, custom, or necessity. This is not the language of exoneration, it is the language of diplomacy, and it begins to sound remarkably familiar. The phrasing mirrors that found in the Oath of Avignon, employing terms such as unity, sacrifice, and avoidance of scandal, a delicate balancing act between truth and survival. The parchment acknowledges missteps, but appeals for mercy in the name of ecclesial cohesion. In doing so, it accomplishes a remarkable feat. It absolves the Templars spiritually while leaving them politically vulnerable. For even as Clement V forgave them, Philip IV was already proceeding to eradicate them. This inherent contradiction, absolution by the Church, execution by the Crown, has perplexed scholars for decades. However, Viewed through the lens of a secret agreement, it gains coherent meaning. The sheen on parchment may represent the physical manifestation of that bargain, a papal promise not to condemn in exchange for a silent dissolution. The document's wording supports this interpretation. It states that the Templar leaders, having confessed and expressed remorse, are to be reconciled with the Church. There is no mention of returning to command, no restitution of lands, merely reconciliation, followed by silence. A silence that persisted for nearly 7 centuries. The parchment itself vanished from the Vatican's working records almost immediately. Its discovery, in a misfiled envelope, astonished historians, not because it existed, but because of its prolonged concealment. It was not hidden in a sealed vault, nor was it coded or incinerated. It was simply misplaced, forgotten, perhaps deliberately. And this act of forgetfulness is an integral part of the narrative, a kind of slow-motion betrayal, perpetrated not by sword or flame, but by strategic inaction. This, once again, echoes the peculiar illness of Pope Clement V after the alleged secret meeting, the missing day in his diary, the monk who embraced a vow of silence, the broken seal on a letter that was never dispatched. At every juncture, the same pattern emerges. Decisions made, then submerged beneath layers of ritual, delay, and indirectness. The sheen on parchment may be the most overt glimpse we acquire of that concealed machinery, a document that affirms an event has occurred but remains silent on its specific nature, framing its language so meticulously that it disorients the reader until one realizes that such obfuscation is precisely its intended purpose. For the sheen on parchment does not exonerate the Templars, it subtly sacrifices them. It grants them absolution, not protection, and it does so in language designed to quietly integrate into ecclesiastical records, far from the scaffolds and flames where their brethren would perish. There is one additional detail rarely mentioned. On the reverse side of the parchment, scribbled in what appears to be a different hand, are 4 Latin words, ut fiat oblivio. This translates to, so that forgetting may be made. It is not a quote from Scripture, nor does it appear in known liturgical texts. It is, by all accounts, an original phrase, and it resonates with the tone of the entire operation. Forget them not to erase their guilt, but to preserve the peace. Forget them, because remembrance would necessitate an explanation as to why a pope forgave what a king burned. Forget them, because even absolution was a political maneuver. And so, the sheen on parchment now rests in a Vatican drawer, its text available online for all to read, its meaning still subject to debate. However, if one interprets it not as a judgment, but as a strategic chess move, one square sacrificed to preserve the remainder of the board, it begins to resonate with quiet power. It is not an answer, it is a mirror. And in it, we perceive not merely the fate of the Templars, but the insidious mechanisms by which history is deliberately made to forget. Numerous theories exist regarding the demise of the Knights Templar. Some attribute it to the Pope, cornered and weary, unable to resist the crown. Others insist it was Philip IV, avaricious and calculating, hungry for gold and power. Still others place blame on the Templars themselves, secretive, proud, perhaps too independent for their own good. But what if none of these figures were the true architect? What if, concealed behind the pageantry of kings and popes, there existed an entirely different individual, someone without a throne, without a mitre who wielded neither crown nor crozier, but rather influence, silence, and meticulous precision? A name surfaces precisely once in a deeply concealed dispatch sent from the French royal court to a papal notary in Avignon. The letter itself is unremarkable, filled with financial updates and references to border matters. However, in the margin of the 3rd page, penned in a different ink and in a far less formal Latin, the words appear, Mandatum ex obscuro Dominus S, an order from the shadows, Lord S. It is so cryptic, so anomalous, that most scholars dismissed it as a scribal error or a metaphor. However, one researcher, an Italian historian with access to noble family archives, proposed a bolder interpretation. He suggested that Dominus S was not a metaphor at all, but a person, a man operating discreetly between the papal curia and the French monarchy, known to both, yet loyal to neither an orchestrator, and he may have possessed a name, Guillaume de Sabran. Before one questions his identity, it is precisely this anonymity that is central to the point. Guillaume de Sabran was not a cardinal, nor was he even a clergyman. He was a lay advisor to a prominent southern French noble family, educated in Rome, fluent in Greek and Arabic, with a long history of mediation between church and state. His letters, the few that survive, are couched in riddles, code, and occasional sarcasm. However, his signature invariably includes a peculiar symbol, a broken key crossed with a sword. The same symbol, incidentally, etched on the silver medallion discussed previously. Sabran held no official position in 1307, yet he commanded significant access. Records indicate his presence in Avignon during the same week as the missing day in the Pope's diary. A servant's testimony, buried decades later in a land dispute file, mentions a gentleman with eyes like river stones who dined with men of robes and never prayed. There is also evidence of his presence in Chinon around the time of the mysterious order, where prisoners were instructed in matters not documented. And one surviving page of his private notebook, now preserved in a monastery outside Arles, contains a single tantalizing phrase, "When all must burn, arrange the ashes." This is the kind of sentence that only becomes ominous in hindsight. So, why suspect him? What did he gain? Sabran was aligned with a banking family connected to both Lombard creditors and certain Roman guilds that would later directly benefit from the redistribution of Templar lands. He served as a bridge between finance and theology, between regional and royal interests. In the collapse of the Templars, his allies profited immensely, acquiring titles, trade routes, and papal favor. Yet, he himself did not rise. He faded. Some believe he was eliminated. Others contend he withdrew by choice. His last known correspondence, unsigned but attributed by handwriting analysis, reads, "My work is done. My name was never meant to be remembered." This, too, aligns with the established pattern. Everywhere in this investigation, in the silences of monks, the faded parchments, the broken seals, a theme of vanishing, of intentional disappearance, has been observed, not only of the Templars but of the decisions, and perhaps the decision-makers themselves. Sabran, if involved, may have acted as a mechanism, an assassin in the political sense, not a killer of men, but of structures, a strategist, the individual who whispered in both ears and then withdrew before the knives were openly drawn. This hypothesis may appear fragile, constructed from scattered fragments, speculation, and intuition, and that is a fair assessment. However, consider this. Every conspiracy requires a coordinator, someone who moves between disparate camps, speaks the language of diplomacy, and comprehends both the cost of action and the price of delay. And who better than someone invisible? Reconsider. A banker disappears, a monk falls silent, a pope loses his voice, a parchment fades. What connects these disparate events may not be theology or treasure, but choreography, timing the meticulously arranged music of collapse. A quiet arrangement to terminate a dangerous order with minimal resistance and maximal deniability. And Sabran, more than any other name encountered, fits that mold. Even the Chinon parchment, so formal and rigid, appears suddenly theatrical in this light, not a record, but a performance, a means to fulfill obligations while explicitly stating nothing, the kind of maneuver a professional shadow might recommend. And here is the chilling part. No one ever actively sought Sabran. He was not interrogated, accused, or questioned. He appears once in court documents concerning a vineyard dispute, and then never again, as if the historical record itself chose to cease mentioning him, as if he had deliberately written himself out of the script. In the grand betrayal of the Templars, Kings and popes occupied center stage, but someone had to pull the curtain. And perhaps, just perhaps, that someone had already departed by the time the curtain fell. It was sealed for centuries, a chamber in Avignon, tucked deep within the old episcopal palace, behind layers of later construction, forgotten even by the clergy who traversed its halls. A room so thoroughly concealed that it escaped notice during revolutions, wars, and restorations. It was not until a structural inspection in the mid-28th century, intended to assess a crumbling corridor, that workers accidentally dislodged a section of plaster, exposing a hidden door. The wood was ancient, brittle, yet the hinges still allowed movement. What they discovered inside was extraordinary. A small, domed, octagonal room, devoid of windows, illuminated only by a high, narrow slit in the ceiling, designed to capture sunlight for a single hour each day. Stone benches were built into the walls in a perfect ring. At the center, an inset circular pattern adorned the floor, once inlaid with colored marble, now mostly chipped away. There were no symbols on the walls, no paintings, no altars, only space, balanced, measured, intentional. They named it La Salle Silencieuse, the silent room. For an extended period, no consensus could be reached regarding its function. It was too ornate for storage, too plain for worship, too meticulously concealed for public use. However, one detail proved pivotal. Above the entryway, faintly discernible beneath centuries of soot and whitewash, was a Latin inscription: Quod concilium servator, hic non in terra remanebit. What is decided here shall not remain on earth. The phrase is not scriptural, nor is it cited in church canons. In fact, it does not appear in any known liturgical record prior to 1300. Yet, it precisely matches a phrase found in a marginal note by the Benedictine chronicler, Brother Mathieu of Arles, who, as we recall, embraced a vow of silence shortly after the alleged Templar meeting in Avignon. He had inscribed it on the inside cover of his sole surviving volume, then never penned another word. That alone would be suggestive. But the chamber offered further evidence. Beneath the dust and rubble, restorers discovered faint scorch marks on the stone benches, as if candles had once been placed in a fixed pattern. An analysis of the floor marble revealed traces of beeswax, sufficient to suggest sealed ceremonies, rituals, or oaths. And near one corner, scratch marks indicated where a piece of stone had been deliberately pried loose and then reset. Behind that stone, a hollow now empty, but once utilized to store something small, valuable, and intended for retrieval only under specific conditions. Historians now speculate that this room may have been where the pivotal events transpired. The final negotiation, the secret meeting, not in some grand basilica or gilded council chamber, but here, in this cold, controlled, private space where nothing could be overheard and nothing left behind except dust, wax, and implication. Its dimensions align with period descriptions of a consulting chamber employed by Clement V's private advisors. Its location on the north end of the palace, removed from the residential wings, corresponds with the access paths taken by unofficial visitors. And its architectural style, slightly older than the surrounding structures, suggests it was repurposed from an earlier building, possibly a Templar commandery itself, later absorbed into the expanding papal complex. The evidence, though circumstantial, is compelling. More intriguingly, the chamber aligns directly beneath a smaller sacristy, added 2 decades later, one never used for mass, but invariably kept locked. When workers opened the floor of that sacristy during repairs, they discovered a thin metal grate directly above the domed chamber, a listening point, a confessional vent, or a means to bear witness without being seen. And then there is the ledger. A rediscovered fragment from a 14th century palace inventory describes a room referred to as Sancta Compensatio, the Holy Bargain. That is not the kind of name typically assigned to a mere broom closet. All these elements, the room, the inscription, the silence that followed, connect back to the overarching theme that has emerged throughout this investigation. Not merely secrecy, but architecture deliberately designed for secrecy. A physical space engineered to safeguard not just words, but the silence after those words. The room was not public, it was not decorative. It existed solely for moments that were meant to disappear. And yet, it did not entirely disappear, because one now stands, metaphorically, within its history. One comprehends the inscription, the dimensions, and what might have been articulated within its confines by men in robes and men in armor, illuminated by a single shaft of light. Their voices are lost to time, but their choices are indelibly carved into stone. And this is where the disparate threads begin to converge. The Pope's missing day, the Templars' vanishing banker, the oath that was not spoken but signed, the disappearing ink, the parchment that simultaneously forgave and betrayed, the orchestrator with no name. And now, the room that still resonates with their decisions. These choices were not made openly. They were made here, somewhere between heaven and earth, behind a sealed door, in a chamber designed to outlive memory, a place intended not to witness, but to erase. And still, it endures. Not because they failed to conceal it, but because history, like stone, eventually fractures with time. And once a crack appears, no matter how minute, it is only a matter of light finding its way in. One has now traversed this landscape, has one not? Not merely the chamber beneath Avignon, nor the corridors of the Vatican, nor the stone cells of Rouen, or the flame-lit squares of Paris, but rather the profound silence interwoven between them. Through the scattered details, the vanished letters, the hesitant ink, the weighty pauses in the historical record where something significant almost surfaced. And what has been observed, what has been felt, is not the clamor of a public trial. It is the immense weight of a private decision, one that was never intended to be fully revealed. Let us synthesize these elements. Our inquiry commenced with Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, a man who, rather than ranting or raging from the scaffold, delivered a final statement peculiar in tone and ambiguous in content. He seemed to allude not merely to his own innocence, but to a betrayal originating from within, not from adversaries, but from his inner circle. This sentiment was echoed in a whisper, the tale of a Templar named Brother Amory, who met with Pope Clement V and was never seen again. Around this same period, a conspicuous absence was noted. A 24-hour gap in the Pope's meticulously maintained schedule, one unaccounted day in late 1306, enveloped by silence and subsequently followed by illness, perhaps a natural fever, perhaps not. Philip IV, the French king, once a supporter of the Templars, whose finances relied upon them and whose kingdom leaned on their logistical prowess, executed a swift, coordinated, and relentless shift in policy within a matter of months. This was not predicated on rumors, but on directives. The silence permeated further from this point. A Benedictine monk embraced total muteness. A Lombard banker disappeared. Vatican officials sealed records. Flames consumed archives. Inquisition proceedings halted, then erupted into vigorous motion. Repeatedly, we encountered not explicit statements but absences, letters unsent, seals broken and resealed, documents erased, altered, or misfiled. Yet beneath it all, a distinct pattern emerged. And at the epicenter of this pattern, if such a center exists, lies the Oath of Avignon, a papal bull, issued privately, never published, framed as a theological necessity for unity between the Church and the Crown. Its language is precise, apologetic, and veiled. It offers peace in exchange for obedience. It does not explicitly name the Templars. It does not need to. Next comes the Chinon parchment, long considered the definitive word on the matter, a document of forgiveness. But a closer reading reveals it to be a document of conditional grace, of absolution paired with surrender, and beneath it, a marginal note, so that peace may be made forgetting. Thus, they forgot, or rather, they buried, erased, and folded the record inward. Not everyone complied. The archivist, Father Luciani, left a commentary, a mere whisper in his Vatican ledger, referring to the quiet negotiation that destroyed the order, a phrase that now resonates like thunder. And then there was the individual almost overlooked, Guillaume de Sabran. No crown, no robe, merely his fingerprints on everything, a symbol, a presence in the pertinent cities at the opportune moments. A voice operating behind both thrones, never quoted, never seen again. Finally, we arrived at the room itself, still present, still silent. Its walls did not speak, yet they did not fully conceal either. A space meticulously designed for decisions that would never be formally recorded. So, what transpired? The evidence points not to a singular act of betrayal, but to a quiet agreement. Sometime in late 1306 or early 1307, representatives of the papacy and the French crown, possibly aided by intermediaries such as Sabran, met in secret to resolve a burgeoning crisis. The Templars had grown too powerful, too independent, too entangled with both power and debt. Their influence had outstripped their accountability. In essence, they constituted a liability. However, to destroy them outright risked profound scandal. Therefore, a plan was meticulously crafted, a dissolution disguised as judgment, a series of steps choreographed for public perception, arrests, trials, confessions, extracted under duress, all while the fundamental decision had already been concluded behind closed doors. In return for agreeing to dissolve, the Templars, particularly their leadership, were offered spiritual absolution. No official condemnation from the Church, no declaration of heresy from the papacy, merely a quiet exit. However, something went awry. Perhaps de Molay ultimately refused to play his designated role. Perhaps someone, potentially even Clement, attempted to reverse the decision. Perhaps Philip decided that mere silence was insufficient, that he required spectacle fire, a definitive severance. Whatever the circumstances, the agreement held only on paper, and so, the final days of the Templars unfolded in dissonance. The Pope asserting one thing, the King executing another, the records blurred, and the voices that could provide explanation vanishing. This is not the kind of mystery that is definitively solved. It is the kind that pervades one's understanding, because the betrayal is not found in a single moment or a singular document. It is discerned in the silence between them, in the page that should have been numbered but is not, in the phrase that abruptly ceases, in the meeting room that no one claimed to have entered, but which undeniably still exists. And that is the tragedy of the Templars. Not that they were overcome by might, but that they were undone by a whisper. Therefore, at the conclusion of this protracted and silent journey, one possesses knowledge exceeding that of most, not merely concerning knights and kings, parchments and palaces, but concerning the spaces between them, the quiet chambers where decisions were made without minutes, the wax seals pressed onto documents never intended to endure, the fading echo of words whispered centuries ago, now conveyed by dust and informed conjecture. What ultimately ended the Templars was not the pyre, nor the confession, nor even the crown. It was a decision rendered quietly, sealed privately, and publicly forgotten. And the most unsettling aspect is that it succeeded. The order dissolved, their wealth redistributed, their knowledge scattered, their memory reshaped. And the individuals who initiated the process departed unstained, recorded not as villains but as guardians of the realm, defenders of the faith, and servants of peace. Yet, in the fractures of history, their voices can be heard. One has heard them too, have they not? The Grand Master's final, unreadable gaze, the medallion bearing no name, the burned letters, the vow of silence, the chamber devoid of evident doors. None of it screams, none of it pleads, it simply waits. And now, perhaps, the reason for this becomes apparent, because the most perilous truths are not those that incite rage. They are those that lull one into believing nothing untoward occurred, but something did. A knight entered a palace and never emerged. A pope drafted a parchment and filed it in the incorrect drawer. A king signed an order and slept soundly that night, and the world continued its rotation. That, more than anything else, defines the nature of true betrayal. It does not announce itself. It does not unfurl flags. It simply departs, allowing time to accomplish the rest. And now, one is also part of this narrative. One carries the knowledge, the outline of what might have been decided somewhere beneath a stone ceiling in Avignon, as candlelight flickered across unblinking eyes, and an entire order hung precariously in the balance. It is not necessary to believe every detail. It is not necessary to determine if it was just. One need only remember that sometimes the most pivotal turning points in history are not loud. They are quiet, meticulously executed, and their echoes still resonate. Therefore, as we metaphorically depart these halls of shadow, as the dust settles and the torches dim, allow a moment for the silence to communicate. For within that silence, there may yet be voices awaiting discovery.